When I was 14, I found something terrifying in the woods. I have never told anyone the full truth about what happened to me in Black Hollow National Forest during the summer of 1987. Not my wife, not my children, not even the therapist I saw for 3 years after the nightmares became unbearable. Some truths are too heavy to share, too impossible to explain without watching the doubt creep into the eyes of someone you love. But I am 61 years old now, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades working as a forest ranger in the very woods that haunt my dreams. I have earned the right to tell this story, and perhaps more importantly, I have earned the right to finally be believed. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I am the senior ranger at Black Hollow National Forest in northern Montana. I have held this position for 23 years, and before that, I worked as a junior ranger and then a trail supervisor in various parks across the Pacific Northwest. People often ask me why I chose this career, why I would dedicate my entire life to the wilderness after what happened to me as a child. The answer is complicated, but if I am being honest, it comes down to this. I needed to understand. I needed to know if what I saw that summer was real, or if my 14-year-old mind had simply cracked under the weight of fear and isolation. After 47 years of searching, I still do not have a satisfying answer, but I have seen enough to know that the forests of this world hold secrets that defy explanation, and I have come to accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Let me take you back to the beginning. The summer of 1987 was supposed to be an adventure. My father, Richard Whitmore, was a geology professor at the University of Montana, and he had arranged for our family to spend 6 weeks in a remote cabin near the northern boundary of Black Hollow National Forest. The cabin belonged to a colleague of his, a retired professor named Harold Jennings, who had built the structure himself in the early 1960s. It sat at the end of a 12-mile dirt road that wound through some of the densest forest I had ever seen, and the nearest town was a 3-hour drive away. My father called it a research expedition. My mother, Patricia, called it a nightmare in the making. Looking back, I think she was closer to the truth than any of us realized. I was 14 years old that summer, caught in that awkward space between childhood and adolescence where everything felt too big and too small at the same time. I had just finished 8th grade, and my social life consisted primarily of playing Dungeons and Dragons with 2 other outcasts in my friend Derek Patterson's basement. I was skinny, awkward, and painfully shy, the kind of kid who preferred the company of books to the company of people. When my father announced the trip, I was initially excited. 6 weeks in the wilderness sounded like the perfect escape from the suffocating expectations of high school that loomed on the horizon. I imagined myself emerging from those woods transformed, confident and capable, ready to face whatever challenges awaited me. I was so naive. My younger sister, Emily, was 11 years old that summer, and she shared none of my enthusiasm for the trip. She complained constantly during the drive up, asking when we would arrive, why there was no television at the cabin, whether she could bring her cat. My parents took turns answering her questions with the patient exhaustion of people who had done this many times before. I remember staring out the window as we drove deeper into the forest, watching the trees grow thicker and the shadows grow longer, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and unease that I could not quite explain. The road seemed to narrow with every mile, the branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers, and by the time we finally reached the cabin, the sun had begun to set and the forest had taken on a quality of darkness that felt almost solid. The cabin itself was exactly what you would expect from a structure built by a retired academic with more ambition than skill. It was a 2-story log building with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch that sagged ominously in several places. The windows were small and dirty, and the front door hung slightly crooked in its frame. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read, "Jennings Retreat" in faded letters, and someone had carved a crude image of a pine tree into the wood below. My father declared it perfect. My mother declared it a death trap. My sister declared that she wanted to go home. I declared nothing. I was too busy staring at the tree line, at the wall of darkness that began perhaps 50 feet from the cabin's front porch and seemed to stretch on forever. I had been in forests before, of course. Montana is not exactly lacking in wilderness, but this was different. This forest felt alive in a way that I had never experienced, as if the trees themselves were watching us, waiting to see what we would do. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a bird I could not identify, and the distant sound of water moving over rocks. I remember thinking that this was what the world must have felt like before humans existed, when the wilderness was truly wild, and we were nothing more than prey. My father spent the first evening unpacking his equipment and explaining his research plans in exhaustive detail. He was studying the geological formations in this region, something about glacial deposits and mineral compositions that I pretended to understand, but mostly ignored. My mother busied herself with making the cabin habitable, scrubbing surfaces and checking for signs of rodent infestation and complaining about the lack of running water. My sister retreated to her room on the second floor and did not emerge until dinner. I wandered around the property, exploring the boundaries of what would become my prison for the next 6 weeks. The cabin sat in a small clearing that had been carved out of the forest at some point in the past, but nature was clearly working to reclaim the space. The grass was overgrown and filled with wildflowers I did not recognize, and several young trees had sprouted near the edges, their branches reaching toward the cabin as if trying to pull it back into the wilderness. Behind the main structure was a smaller building that my father identified as an old storage shed, though the door was padlocked and the windows were boarded up from the inside. When I asked why, my father shrugged and said that Harold had probably stored his research materials there and did not want anyone disturbing them. I accepted this explanation at the time, but I have thought about that shed many times over the years, wondered what secrets it might have held, wondered if Harold Jennings knew something about this place that he never told my father. The first few days passed without incident. My father disappeared into the forest each morning with his equipment, returning in the late afternoon covered in dirt and filled with enthusiasm about his findings. My mother established a routine of cooking, cleaning, and reading the stack of novels she had brought with her, occasionally venturing outside to sit on the porch and watch the birds. My sister found a collection of old board games in a closet and spent most of her time playing solitaire versions of them, talking to herself in voices she assigned to imaginary opponents, and I explored. I want to be clear about something. I did not go looking for trouble. I was not the kind of kid who sought out danger or thrills. I was cautious by nature, the sort of person who always looked both ways before crossing the street and never went swimming less than 30 minutes after eating. But there was something about that forest that called to me, something that whispered at the edges of my consciousness and drew me deeper into the trees with each passing day. I told myself that I was being scientific, that I was cataloging the flora and fauna like a real naturalist. I brought a notebook with me and wrote down descriptions of the birds I saw, the plants I encountered, the insects that buzzed around my head. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that I felt compelled to explore, as if the forest itself was inviting me in, and I was too young and too curious to recognize the danger in that invitation. On the 4th day, I found the first marker. I had wandered farther from the cabin than I had intended, following a deer trail that wound through a particularly dense section of forest. The trees here were old and massive, their trunks wider than my arm span, and the canopy above was so thick that almost no sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was cool and damp, and the smell of decay was everywhere, that rich organic scent of rotting leaves and fallen logs returning to the earth. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange on a tree to my right. Someone had carved a symbol into the bark. It was about 6 inches across, positioned at roughly eye level, and it consisted of a circle with 3 lines extending from the center to the edge, like a wheel with 3 spokes. The carving was old. I could tell by the way the bark had partially grown over the edges, but it was still clearly visible, and there was something deliberate about its placement that made me uneasy. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, trying to understand what it meant. I told myself that it was probably just a trail marker, something left by hunters or hikers to help them navigate the forest. But it did not look like any trail marker I had ever seen, and there was something about the symbol itself that felt wrong, though I could not have explained why. I reached out and touched it. The bark was rough beneath my fingers, and the grooves of the carving were smooth, worn down by time and weather. As my fingertips traced the lines, I felt a sudden chill run through my body, as if the temperature had dropped by 20 degrees in an instant. I jerked my hand back and looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. The birds had stopped singing, the insects had stopped buzzing, even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air perfectly still and silent. I stood there in that silence, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time since we had arrived, I felt genuinely afraid. I do not know how long I stood there before the sound broke the silence. It was a high, thin noise, almost like a whistle but not quite, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. It rose and fell in a pattern that seemed almost musical, though the melody was nothing I recognized. I listened to it for perhaps 30 seconds, frozen in place, before my survival instincts finally kicked in, and I turned and ran. I did not stop running until I reached the cabin. My mother was on the porch when I burst out of the tree line, and her face shifted from surprise to concern as she took in my appearance. I must have looked half wild, red-faced and sweating, my clothes torn from the branches I had pushed through in my panic. She asked me what was wrong, and I opened my mouth to tell her about the symbol and the sound and the terrible silence, but the words would not come. How could I explain something that I did not understand myself? How could I make her believe that something in that forest had frightened me when I could not even articulate what that something was? I told her that I had gotten lost and panicked. She accepted this explanation with the gentle skepticism of a mother who knows her child is not telling the whole truth, but decides not to push. She made me sit down and drink a glass of water and promised not to wander so far from the cabin again. I agreed to everything she said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew that I would not keep that promise. The forest had shown me something, and I needed to understand what it meant. That night, I dreamed of the symbol for the first time. In the dream, I was standing in a vast clearing surrounded by trees that stretched up into a sky with no stars. The symbol was carved into the ground beneath my feet, enormous and glowing with a faint greenish light. I could feel it pulsing beneath me, like a heartbeat, and I knew with the certainty of dreams that something was coming, something that had been waiting a very long time. I woke up just before dawn, drenched in sweat, the echo of that whistling sound still ringing in my ears. I did not tell anyone about the dream. I did not tell anyone about any of the dreams that followed. The next morning, my father announced that he wanted to take a family hike to a waterfall that Harold Jennings had mentioned in his notes. It was about 4 miles from the cabin, according to the crude map that Harold had drawn, and my father was eager to see it. My mother agreed reluctantly. My sister complained as expected, and I said nothing, still shaken from the events of the previous day. We set out after breakfast, following a trail that my father claimed to have identified, though it quickly became clear that his navigation skills were not as sharp as his geological expertise. We walked for nearly 2 hours, pushing through undergrowth and climbing over fallen logs, before my father finally admitted that he might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. My mother responded with the controlled fury of someone who had predicted exactly this outcome, and an argument ensued that I tried to ignore by wandering a few yards off the path to examine a particularly interesting mushroom. That was when I saw the second marker. It was identical to the first one, the same circle, the same 3 lines, but this time it was carved into a boulder that sat at the base of a large oak tree. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest, before I heard my father calling my name. I hurried back to the group without mentioning what I had found, but I spent the rest of the hike scanning the trees for more symbols. I saw 2 more before we finally found the waterfall, both carved into trees at roughly the same height as the first one. The waterfall was beautiful, I suppose, a 40-foot cascade of white water tumbling over a cliff face into a deep pool surrounded by mossy rocks. My parents took photographs and my sister complained about getting wet, and I sat on a boulder at the edge of the pool, watching the water and thinking about the symbols. They were not random, I realized. They were placed at regular intervals, marking a path through the forest. But a path to where? And who had made them? I wanted to ask my father if he knew anything about them, but something held me back. Some instinct told me that this was not a secret to share. Not yet, not until I understood what I was dealing with. We made it back to the cabin without incident, though the journey took longer than expected and we arrived just as the sun was setting. My father grumbled about his miscalculations while my mother started dinner, and my sister retreated to her room to continue her solitary board games. I sat on the porch and watched the darkness gather at the edge of the clearing, thinking about the symbols and the whistling sound and the dreams that had begun to haunt my sleep. That night, I heard the sound again. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, that same high, thin whistle rising and falling in its strange melody. I lay in my bed and listened to it, my body rigid with fear, my mind racing with questions I could not answer. The sound seemed to go on for hours, though when I finally fell asleep and woke to daylight, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew that I had not. I knew that something was out there in the darkness, something that was aware of me, something that was waiting. I spent the next several days conducting my own investigation. While my parents believed I was simply exploring the area around the cabin, I was actually following the trail of symbols deeper into the forest. I found more of them as I went, always carved at the same height, always positioned to be visible from the previous marker. The trail led me through sections of forest that grew increasingly dense and dark, past rock formations that looked almost deliberate in their arrangement, over streams that ran black with tannins from the decaying leaves. I kept careful notes in my notebook, mapping the location of each symbol, trying to discern a pattern in their placement. On the 7th day of my investigation, I found the clearing. I had been following the markers for perhaps 2 hours when the forest suddenly opened up, revealing a space that was utterly unlike anything I had seen before. It was roughly circular, maybe 100 feet across, and the ground was covered not with grass or undergrowth, but with bare earth the color of ash. The trees at the edges of the clearing seemed to lean away from the center, their branches reaching back toward the forest as if trying to escape. And in the very middle of the clearing, partially buried in the gray soil, was a structure that I could not identify. It looked like stone, though the surface had a texture that seemed almost organic, like petrified flesh. It rose perhaps 4 feet out of the ground, and its shape suggested something larger beneath the surface, as if what I was seeing was just the tip of some massive buried object. The symbol, the circle with 3 lines, was carved into every visible surface, repeated over and over in various sizes, covering the stone so completely that there was almost no unmarked space remaining. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, afraid to step onto that gray soil, afraid to approach that terrible monument. The air here was different, thicker somehow, and colder than it should have been given the summer heat. There was no sound at all, not even the ambient noise of the forest that I had grown accustomed to. It was as if this place existed in a bubble of silence, cut off from the world around it. I do not know what compelled me to step forward. Fear should have kept me rooted to the spot, should have sent me running back to the safety of the cabin. But there was something else at work, some force that seemed to pull me toward that stone structure despite every instinct screaming at me to flee. I took one step, then another, and then I was walking across that gray earth, my feet leaving prints in the ash-colored soil, my eyes fixed on the carved stone ahead. When I was perhaps 10 feet from the structure, I heard the voice. It did not come from any particular direction. It seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, from the stone and the soil and the air itself. It was not speaking words, not exactly, but I understood it nonetheless. The way you understand the meaning of a dream without being able to explain it in waking language. It was ancient, that voice, older than the trees, older than the mountains, older than anything I had ever encountered. And it was aware of me. It knew my name, my fears, my deepest secrets. It knew everything, and it wanted me to know that it knew. I screamed. I think I screamed. I have no clear memory of the moments that followed, only fragments. Running through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the sensation of being pursued by something I could not see. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in a heap on the forest floor, sobbing and shaking and praying to a God I was not sure I believed in. When I finally regained enough composure to look around, I realized that I had no idea where I was. The forest looked the same in every direction, an endless maze of trees and shadows, and the sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds that made it impossible to determine direction. I was lost, truly lost, in a wilderness that suddenly felt malevolent in a way I had never experienced before. I do not know how long I wandered. Hours, certainly. Perhaps the entire day. The light began to fade, and my panic grew with every passing minute. I called out for my parents, for anyone, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the trees, absorbed into the silence that pressed in from all sides. I was going to die out here, I thought. I was going to die, and no one would ever find my body, and my parents would spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to their son. That was when I heard the whistling. It came from somewhere to my left, that same strange melody I had heard from my bedroom window. But this time, instead of filling me with fear, it filled me with something like hope. It was a sound, a direction, something to follow in this endless maze of identical trees. I knew on some level that following the sound was probably a terrible idea, but the alternative was wandering until I collapsed from exhaustion, so I turned toward the whistle and began to walk. The sound led me through the forest for what felt like miles. It was always ahead of me, always just out of reach, fading when I got too close and growing stronger when I fell behind. I followed it through dense thickets and across rocky streams, up hills and down into valleys, until finally I stumbled out of the tree line and found myself standing at the edge of a road. Not just any road, the dirt road that led to our cabin. I stood there for a long moment, unable to believe my luck, before I turned and ran in the direction I hoped was home. The cabin appeared around a bend perhaps 20 minutes later, its windows glowing with warm light. and I burst through the front door to find my parents sitting at the dinner table, looking at me with expressions of mild surprise. They had not been worried, they said. I had only been gone for a few hours. They had assumed I was exploring, as I always did, and had expected me back for dinner. When I looked at the clock on the wall, I saw that they were right. It was barely 7 in the evening. I had been in the forest for perhaps 4 hours, not the eternity it had felt like. I did not tell them what had happened. I could not find the words, and even if I could, I knew they would not believe me. I ate my dinner in silence, answered their questions with monosyllables, and retreated to my room as soon as I could. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening for the whistle that I was certain would come. It did not come that night, but the dreams did. In the dream, I was back in the clearing, standing before the carved stone structure. But this time, I was not alone. There were others with me, men and women and children, dozens of them, all standing in a circle around the stone with their heads bowed and their eyes closed. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, some in modern clothes, some in garments that looked a century old, some in animal skins that predated any European settlement of this land. And they were all whispering, all speaking in that same wordless language that the voice in the clearing had used, all communing with something that I could not see but could feel, a presence that watched from somewhere beyond the boundaries of the dream. I woke up screaming, and my mother came to my room and held me until the shaking stopped. I told her it was just a nightmare, just the stress of being in an unfamiliar place. She believed me, or at least she pretended to believe me, and eventually she went back to bed and left me alone with my thoughts. I did not sleep again that night. The days that followed were a strange mixture of normalcy and terror. On the surface, our family vacation continued as planned. My father conducted his research, my mother read her books, my sister played her games. But beneath that surface, I was falling apart. The dreams came every night, each one more vivid and disturbing than the last. I saw things in those dreams that I will not describe here, things that stretched the boundaries of what I believed was possible. And during the day, I found myself drawn back to the forest despite my fear, unable to resist the pull of that terrible clearing. I went back 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Each time, I told myself that I was being foolish, that there was nothing there but rocks and trees, that my overactive imagination had created a monster out of shadows and coincidence. And each time, I found the clearing exactly where I had left it, the stone structure waiting for me like an old friend, the silence pressing in from all sides. On my 3rd visit, I found the journal. It was buried in the ash-colored soil near the base of the stone, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly rotted away. The pages inside were yellowed and water-damaged, but many of them were still legible, filled with cramped handwriting that I spent hours deciphering. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Blackwood, and it dated back to the summer of 1923. Samuel Blackwood, I learned, had been a prospector who came to this region looking for gold. He had stumbled upon the clearing by accident, drawn by what he described as a strange melody that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. He had found the stone structure and the carved symbols, and like me, he had felt the presence of something ancient and powerful watching him from just beyond the edge of perception. Unlike me, he had stayed. He had built a camp near the clearing and devoted himself to understanding what he had found. The journal documented his descent into obsession and madness. In the early entries, Samuel was methodical, scientific, approaching the mystery with the rational mind of an educated man. He mapped the symbols, studied the stone, collected samples of the strange soil. He speculated about the origins of the structure, considering possibilities ranging from Native American burial sites to remnants of ancient civilizations. He was curious, but cautious, aware that he was dealing with something beyond his understanding. But as the entries progressed, the tone changed. Samuel began writing about dreams that sounded identical to the ones I had been having. He wrote about hearing voices in the night, voices that spoke to him in a language he could not understand but somehow comprehended. He wrote about seeing figures in the forest, glimpses of people who vanished when he looked directly at them. And he wrote about the feeling that something was changing inside him, that the forest was reshaping him into something new, something that belonged to it rather than to the world he had left behind. The final entries were almost incomprehensible, filled with references to rituals and offerings and transformations that made no logical sense. Samuel wrote about others who had found this place before him, about a cycle that had been repeating for thousands of years, about a hunger that could never be satisfied but could sometimes be appeased. The very last entry, dated August 14th, 1923, consisted of just 3 words. It is time. I sat in that clearing, holding Samuel Blackwood's journal, and understood that I was caught in something much larger and much older than I had imagined. This was not a ghost story or a local legend. This was something real, something that had been waiting in this forest long before humans came to this continent, something that would still be waiting long after we were gone. I should have shown the journal to my parents. I should have demanded that we leave immediately, that we pack up the car and drive away and never look back. But I did not do either of those things. Instead, I hid the journal beneath my mattress and said nothing, and the next morning I went back to the forest to learn more. I told you earlier that I was not the kind of kid who sought out danger or thrills. That was true, once. But something had changed in me since finding that clearing, something fundamental that I could not explain or resist. The fear was still there, always there, but it had been joined by a curiosity that bordered on compulsion. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, even if that understanding came at a terrible cost. I began exploring systematically, following the symbol markers in different directions, mapping the trails that radiated out from the clearing like spokes on a wheel. I found more evidence of previous visitors: a rusted knife with initials carved into the handle, a woman's shoe half buried in the underbrush, a child's doll with one eye missing, staring up at me from a pile of dead leaves. I found more journals too, 3 of them, belonging to people who had found this place over the years. Their stories were all variations on the same theme: the symbols, the voices, the dreams, the slow, inexorable pull towards something they could not name or resist. None of them had happy endings. The second journal belonged to Margaret Hollins, a schoolteacher who had visited the area in 1947. She had been hiking with a group of friends when she became separated from them and stumbled upon the clearing. Her entries documented a gradual transformation similar to Samuel's: the dreams, the voices, the growing certainty that she had found something that humanity was not meant to find. Her final entry was a letter to her family, apologizing for what she was about to do, begging them not to come looking for her. The third journal was more recent, written by a young man named David Chen, who had been camping in the forest in 1971. David's entries were angrier, more desperate, filled with profanity and accusations and pleas for help. He had tried to escape, he wrote. He had packed up his gear and hiked for days, following the sun and his compass, but every path led him back to the clearing. He could not leave. The forest would not let him leave. The fourth journal was the worst. It was written by a child, a girl, based on the handwriting and the content, who could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her entries were brief and poorly spelled, the observations of a young mind trying to make sense of something incomprehensible. She wrote about a family trip, about getting lost in the woods, about the nice voices that promised to help her find her way home. The last entry was a drawing, a circle with 3 lines extending from the center, surrounded by stick figures with no faces. I read those journals over and over, searching for clues, looking for patterns, trying to understand the rules of the game I had unwittingly entered. And the more I read, the more I realized that I was following a path that others had walked before me, a path that ended in disappearance or death or something worse than either. I decided to leave. It was the morning of our 4th week at the cabin, and I woke up with a clarity that I had not felt since arriving. The dreams had been particularly bad the night before. I had seen the clearing filled with bodies, hundreds of them, all reaching up toward a sky that burned with colors I could not name, and something in me had finally broken. I was done with this place. I was done with the mysteries and the symbols and the voices that whispered in the darkness. I wanted to go home, back to my boring life and my boring friends and my boring future. I wanted to forget that any of this had ever happened. I told my parents at breakfast. I said that I was homesick, that I missed my friends, that I was tired of being so far from civilization. My mother looked sympathetic. She had never really wanted to come here in the first place. My father looked disappointed but understanding. He said that we had 2 more weeks scheduled, but if I was really unhappy, he would consider cutting the trip short. I was so relieved that I almost cried. But that afternoon, my sister disappeared. We did not realize she was gone until dinner. She had been in her room all day, or so we thought, playing her solitary board games and talking to her imaginary friends. But when my mother went to call her for the meal, the room was empty. The window was open, and through it we could see the forest, dark and waiting. My mother screamed. My father ran outside, calling Emily's name, his voice growing more desperate with each repetition. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She had wandered off. She had gotten lost. She had found the clearing and the stone and the presence that waited there, and now she was gone, just like all the others, just like Samuel Blackwood and Margaret Hollins and David Chen and the little girl whose name I had never learned. This was my fault. I had brought something into this house, some attention from the forest that should have stayed focused on me. I had been selfish, thinking only of my own escape, and now Emily was paying the price. I grabbed a flashlight and ran into the woods. I do not remember much about the search that followed. I know that I ran for hours, following trails and pushing through underbrush, calling my sister's name until my voice gave out. I know that at some point my parents joined me, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like the eyes of frightened animals. I know that we searched until the batteries died and the night grew so dark that we could barely see our own hands in front of our faces. And I know that we found nothing. We made our way back to the cabin in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and terrified, and my father drove the 3 hours to the nearest town to call for help. The police came the next day, along with volunteers and search dogs and a helicopter that circled overhead in a futile attempt to spot something through the dense canopy. They searched for 5 days, covering miles of forest, and they found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Emily had ever existed. On the 6th day, they called off the search. I remember the official who delivered the news, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a voice that was carefully calibrated to convey sympathy without hope. He said that they had done everything they could, that the forest was too vast and too wild, that sometimes people just vanished without a trace. He said that they would keep the case open, would continue to investigate any leads, would never stop looking for answers, but his eyes told a different story. His eyes told me that my sister was gone, and that no amount of searching would bring her back. My parents fell apart. My mother retreated into a silence that lasted for months, a shell of grief that nothing could penetrate. My father buried himself in work, taking on extra classes and research projects, anything to avoid being alone with his thoughts. And I carried the guilt like a stone in my chest, the knowledge that I had known something was wrong with this place, that I had kept secrets instead of sounding alarms, that I might have saved my sister if only I had been brave enough to tell the truth. We left the cabin the day after the search was called off. We packed our belongings in silence, loaded them into the car without speaking, and drove away from Black Hollow National Forest with Emily's empty seat between me and the window. I remember looking back as we reached the end of the dirt road, seeing the trees closing behind us like a curtain, and knowing with absolute certainty that I would come back someday. Not because I wanted to. I would have been happy never to see another tree for the rest of my life, but because the forest was not finished with me. I had escaped, but escape was only temporary. Sooner or later, I would return. It took me 20 years. In the intervening decades, I lived what might have been a normal life from the outside. I finished high school, went to college, got a degree in forestry that my parents did not understand but did not question. I worked various jobs in various parks, moving around the country, never staying in one place for too long. I got married, had 2 children, watched them grow up with a mixture of pride and terror that I could never quite explain to my wife. I had relationships and responsibilities, and all the trappings of ordinary existence. But underneath it all, the dreams continued, and the guilt never faded, and I knew that I was just marking time, waiting for the call that would bring me back to where I belonged. The call came in 2007, 20 years after Emily disappeared. I was working as a ranger in a national forest in Oregon when I got a letter from the Montana Department of Natural Resources. They were hiring a senior ranger for Black Hollow National Forest, and someone had recommended me for the position. The letter did not say who had made the recommendation, and when I called to ask, no one seemed to know. It was as if the job had materialized out of nowhere, designed specifically for me, waiting for me to accept. I should have thrown the letter away. I should have continued my safe, predictable life in Oregon, far from the shadows of my past. But I could not. I had spent 20 years running from something that refused to be outrun, and I was tired. If the forest wanted me back, then maybe it was time to stop fighting and start understanding. Maybe, I told myself, I could finally learn the truth about what had happened to Emily. Maybe I could find some closure, some peace, some end to the nightmares that had haunted me for half my life. I accepted the position. My wife thought I was crazy. She was probably right. The first time I drove back down that dirt road, I felt like I was traveling through time. The forest looked exactly as I remembered it, the same towering trees, the same deep shadows, the same sense of watchful presence pressing in from all sides. Even the cabin was still there, though it had deteriorated significantly in the years since our visit. Harold Jennings had died in 1994, I learned. and his property had been absorbed into the national forest. The cabin was scheduled to be demolished, but budget constraints had kept it standing, a memorial to a past that no one wanted to remember. I did not go inside. Not that first day. I drove past it, continued down the road to the ranger station, and began my new life as the guardian of the forest that had taken my sister. The years that followed were a strange mixture of mundane and extraordinary. Most of my job was exactly what you would expect from a forest ranger: maintaining trails, assisting visitors, responding to emergencies, protecting the wilderness from those who would damage it. I dealt with lost hikers and injured animals and illegal hunters and all the ordinary challenges of managing a vast tract of undeveloped land. I trained junior rangers and attended meetings and filled out paperwork and lived a professional life that was thoroughly unremarkable. But beneath that ordinary surface, I was conducting an investigation that no one knew about. I mapped the symbols, every one of them, in every corner of the forest that I could reach. I found dozens of markers beyond the ones I had discovered as a child, some recently carved and some so ancient that the trees had nearly swallowed them whole. The patterns they formed were complex and unsettling, lines and circles and spirals that seemed to suggest a geometry I could not quite grasp. I compiled my findings in notebooks that I kept hidden in my home, away from prying eyes, adding new entries as I discovered new evidence. I researched the disappearances. They were disturbingly common in this area. Men, women, and children who had vanished without a trace over the years, dating back as far as records existed and probably further. Most were attributed to the ordinary dangers of the wilderness: accidents, animal attacks, simple disorientation in an unforgiving landscape. But some were different. Some had circumstances that echoed my own experience. People who had reported hearing strange sounds or seeing strange symbols. People who had seemed drawn to the forest against their better judgment. People who had simply walked into the trees one day and never emerged. I found more journals, 9 of them over the course of 15 years, hidden in various locations around the forest. Each told a variation of the same story. Each ended the same way: disappearance, death, or a descent into madness that amounted to the same thing. I read them all, multiple times, searching for clues that might explain what we were dealing with, what had taken my sister, what was waiting out there in the darkness. And I went back to the clearing. It was still there, exactly where I remembered it, unchanged by the decades that had passed. The stone structure still rose from the ash-colored soil. The symbols still covered its surface. The silence still pressed in from all sides. I stood at its edge for a long time, listening for the voices, waiting for the presence to make itself known. But nothing happened. The clearing was empty, dormant, as if whatever had lived there had gone away or fallen asleep. I was almost disappointed. I returned to the clearing many times over the years, sometimes alone, sometimes with equipment designed to measure temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, infrasound, anything that might provide a scientific explanation for what I had experienced. The results were inconclusive at best. The clearing was colder than the surrounding forest, that much was certain, and there were some anomalies in the electromagnetic readings that I could not explain. But nothing definitive, nothing that would convince a skeptic, nothing that would justify the terror I felt every time I stepped onto that gray soil. And then, 5 years ago, the disappearances started again. The first one was a hiker named James Morrison, a 23-year-old from Bozeman who had come to Black Hollow for a solo backpacking trip. He had registered at the ranger station, left a detailed itinerary, and promised to check in every 48 hours. When he missed his first check-in, we launched a search. We found his campsite on the second day, tent still standing, gear still inside, food still hanging from a bear rope, but no sign of James himself. He had simply vanished. The second disappearance came 3 months later. A family of 4 from California, Mark and Jennifer Thompson and their 2 children, ages 8 and 12, went missing during what was supposed to be a day hike. They had told the ranger at the trailhead that they planned to walk to a scenic overlook and back, a round trip of perhaps 3 hours. When they had not returned by nightfall, we sent out search parties. We found nothing. The third disappearance was the one that broke me. Her name was Amanda Chen, and she was 26 years old. She had come to Black Hollow to do research for her doctoral dissertation in folklore, specifically studying the indigenous legends associated with this region. She had interviewed me multiple times, asking questions about the history of the forest, the stories I had heard, the strange occurrences that visitors sometimes reported. I liked her. She was smart and curious and genuinely passionate about her work, and I found myself telling her things I had never told anyone else. Not the whole truth, not about my sister or the clearing or the journals I had collected over the years, but enough to pique her interest, enough to make her want to dig deeper. She went into the forest alone on a Tuesday morning, following leads she had developed from her research. She told me she would be back by dinner. She never came back at all. I searched for her personally, spending 3 days in the wilderness, covering ground I knew better than anyone alive. I found her campsite, similar to James Morrison's, gear intact, no sign of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. I found her notebook, filled with observations and speculations that came disturbingly close to the truth I had spent years trying to understand. And I found, in the final pages, a map she had drawn that led directly to the clearing. She had found it. She had gone there alone, and now she was gone. I should have reported everything to the authorities. I should have handed over the journals and the notebooks and the decades of evidence I had accumulated. I should have told them about the clearing and the stone and the presence that waited in the silence. But what could I say that they would believe? That a mysterious force was responsible for the disappearances? That the forest itself was somehow malevolent? They would have thought I was insane. They would have removed me from my position, locked me away somewhere safe, and left the forest to claim more victims. So I kept quiet, and I kept watching, and I kept waiting for an opportunity to do something, anything that might make a difference. That opportunity came 6 months ago. I was conducting a routine patrol along the northern boundary of the forest when I heard it. That same high, thin whistle that had haunted my dreams for nearly 50 years. It was coming from somewhere to my left, deeper in the forest, in a direction I had never explored. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, my hands trembling, knowing that this was the moment I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. I followed the sound. It led me through dense undergrowth and across rocky streams, up hills and down into valleys, exactly as it had when I was 14 years old. But this time, I was not running in panic. This time, I was paying attention, noting landmarks, memorizing the route. This time, I knew what I was walking toward, and I was not afraid. That is a lie. I was terrified. But I had learned over the decades that fear and courage are not opposites. Fear tells you that something matters, that something is at stake. Courage is doing what needs to be done despite that fear. And I had something that needed to be done, something that I should have done a long time ago. The whistle led me to a place I had never seen before, a second clearing, smaller than the first, hidden in a valley that did not appear on any map. At its center was another stone structure, similar to the one I had found as a child, but somehow newer, as if it had been carved more recently. The symbols were the same, but there were more of them, covering not just the stone, but spreading out across the ground in concentric circles, carved directly into the bedrock that lay beneath the forest floor. And standing in the middle of it all, looking exactly as she had 47 years ago, was my sister. Emily turned to face me as I entered the clearing, and I felt my legs buckle beneath me. She was 11 years old, the same age she had been when she disappeared, wearing the same clothes she had been wearing that day, a purple t-shirt with a unicorn on it and faded jeans with grass stains on the knees. Her hair was the same, her face was the same, even the scraped knuckle on her left hand that she had gotten from falling off her bike the week before we left for the cabin. She looked at me with eyes that held no recognition, and she spoke in a voice that was hers and not hers, a voice that carried the echo of something much older and much stranger. She said, "We have been waiting for you, Thomas." I do not know how long I stood there, staring at the thing wearing my sister's face. Time seemed to lose meaning in that place, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to track. The sun moved across the sky in patterns I could not follow, and the shadows in the clearing shifted without apparent cause. I was frozen, paralyzed by a combination of grief and horror, and a desperate, irrational hope that maybe, somehow, this really was Emily. That maybe she had been here all along, waiting for me to come find her. But I knew better. Whatever this thing was, it was not my sister. Emily had died 47 years ago, or worse than died, taken by something that did not understand or care about human concepts like mercy or love. This was a mask, a puppet, a tool being used to manipulate me by something that had been watching me since I was 14 years old. I asked what it wanted. The thing that looked like Emily smiled, and the expression was wrong in ways I struggled to describe. It was too wide, too fixed, too disconnected from the eyes that stared at me with ancient hunger. It began to speak, and the voice shifted as it spoke, sometimes sounding like my sister, sometimes sounding like Samuel Blackwood or Margaret Hollins or any of the others who had found this place over the centuries. It told me things I do not have the words to convey, things about the nature of the forest and the stone and the presence that had waited here since before humans existed. It told me about the cycle, the pattern of arrival and departure that had been repeating for longer than recorded history. It told me about those who had come before, about their choices and their fates, about the bargains they had made and the prices they had paid. And it told me what it wanted from me. I was given a choice, the same choice that had been offered to everyone who found their way to this place. I could accept what was being offered, join the communion of those who had surrendered themselves to the forest, become part of something vast and eternal that transcended the limitations of human existence. I would lose myself, my identity, everything that made me who I was. But in exchange, I would become something more, something that would exist long after the mountains crumbled and the rivers dried up and humanity itself was nothing but a distant memory. Or I could refuse and walk away and live out the remainder of my ordinary human life. But if I refused, I would never see my sister again. I would never understand the full truth of what I had discovered, and I would spend whatever years I had left knowing that I had turned my back on the greatest mystery in human history. I looked at the thing wearing Emily's face, and I thought about the life I had built. My wife, my children, the grandchildren who were not yet born but someday might be. I thought about the sunrise over the mountains and the taste of coffee on a cold morning and the feeling of my wife's hand in mine as we watched our children grow up. I thought about all the small, ordinary moments that make up a human life, the moments that we take for granted until they are threatened with extinction. And I said no. The thing wearing Emily's face did not seem surprised. It nodded, as if this was the answer it had expected, and the expression shifted to something that might have been sadness or might have been relief. It was impossible to tell. It said that the door would remain open, that the choice would always be available to me, that I only had to return to this clearing and speak my acceptance, and everything I had been promised would be mine. And then it vanished, and I was standing alone in an empty clearing, and the sun was setting behind the mountains, and I realized that I had been gone for 3 days. I made my way back to the ranger station in a daze, trying to process what had happened, trying to decide what to do with the knowledge I had gained. My colleagues were frantic. They had been searching for me since I had failed to return from my patrol, had nearly given me up for dead like so many others before me. I told them I had gotten lost, had fallen and hit my head, had been disoriented for days before finding my way out. They did not believe me entirely, but they did not push, and eventually the questions stopped. I have not returned to the clearing since that day. I have continued my work as a ranger, protecting the forest and the people who visit it, knowing what waits out there in the darkness, but choosing to focus on the light instead. I have not told anyone the full truth of what I experienced. Not my wife, not my children, not the authorities who continue to investigate the disappearances that still occur from time to time. Some truths are too heavy to share, too impossible to explain without watching the doubt creep into the eyes of someone you love. But I am telling you now. I am telling you because I am 61 years old, and I can feel the weight of time pressing down on me, and I know that I will not live forever. Someday soon, someone else will find the clearing. Someone else will hear the whistle and follow it into the darkness. Someone else will be offered the same choice I was offered, and they will have to decide for themselves whether the price is worth the promise. Maybe that person is you. Maybe you are reading this story and feeling a strange resonance, a sense that what I am describing is not just fiction or fantasy, but something real, something that has been waiting at the edge of your consciousness for your entire life. Maybe you have seen the symbol somewhere, on a tree in a forest you visited as a child, or in a dream you cannot quite remember, or scratched into the surface of an old stone in a place you cannot name. Maybe you have heard the whistle, late at night when the world is quiet and the boundaries between reality and something else grow thin. If so, I want you to know this. The choice is real. The clearing is real. The presence that waits in the silence is real, and it has been waiting a very long time, and it will continue to wait long after everyone reading these words is dust. You cannot avoid it forever. You can only delay the moment when you have to decide. Choose wisely. I have spent the past 6 months writing this account, trying to capture everything I know and everything I suspect about the mystery that has defined my life. It is not complete. There is so much I still do not understand, so many questions that remain unanswered, but it is the best I can do. I have made arrangements for this document to be published after my death, along with the journals I have collected and the notebooks I have filled over the decades. Maybe some future researcher will find patterns I missed, connections I failed to make. Maybe they will succeed where I have failed, and finally unravel the truth about Black Hollow National Forest and the horror that lives within it. Or maybe they will simply add their own journals to the collection, their own voices to the chorus of the lost. I think about Emily often, more often than I should. I wonder if she is still out there somewhere, trapped in that timeless place between the trees, forever 11 years old, forever waiting for a rescue that will never come. I wonder if the thing wearing her face really was her, some fragment of my sister preserved by the presence in the clearing, or if it was just a mask, a manipulation designed to break down my resistance. I do not know, and I suspect I never will. But I choose to believe that she is at peace. I choose to believe that whatever happened to her in those woods, whatever transformation she underwent, it was not entirely a horror. I choose to believe that there are mysteries in this world that are not evil, just different, and that the presence in the clearing is neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply other, a force of nature as indifferent to human morality as a storm or an earthquake. Maybe I am lying to myself. Maybe the truth is darker than I can bear to acknowledge. But lies are sometimes necessary to survive, and I have survived for 61 years, despite everything the forest has thrown at me. That has to count for something. I am writing these final words from the porch of my home, which sits at the edge of Black Hollow National Forest, within sight of the trees that have haunted my dreams for nearly half a century. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and the forest is alive with the sounds of birds settling down for the night. From here, it looks peaceful, beautiful, the kind of wilderness that people come from all over the world to experience. You would never guess what waits beneath that surface, what secrets hide in the shadows between the trees. I can hear the whistle now, faint but unmistakable, drifting on the evening breeze. It has been calling to me more frequently lately, growing more insistent with each passing day. I do not know if this is because the presence senses my age and weakness, or because it is simply reminding me that the choice remains open, that acceptance is always an option. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. I will not answer the call tonight. Tomorrow, I will put on my ranger uniform and go to work and protect the forest and the people who visit it, just as I have done for the past 2 decades. I will smile and wave and pretend that everything is normal, that the world is exactly as it appears, that there are no monsters hiding in the darkness. But the night after tomorrow, or the week after that, or the year after that, I do not know. The whistle is patient, and so is the thing that makes it. They have been waiting for longer than human history, and they can wait a little longer. As for me, I am tired. I have fought this battle for 47 years, and I am not sure how much fight I have left. The nightmares come every night now, and I wake each morning feeling less like myself and more like a stranger wearing my face. I see the symbols everywhere. In the patterns of leaves on the ground, in the clouds that drift across the sky, in the grain of the wood on my porch railing. They are calling to me, reminding me that I have unfinished business, that there is a door I have not yet walked through. Maybe one day I will walk through it. Maybe the weariness will win out over the fear, and I will answer the call that has been echoing through my life since I was 14 years old. Maybe I will finally learn the truth about my sister, about the forest, about the presence that has watched me since the moment I touched that first carved symbol. Or maybe I will die in my bed, surrounded by family, and the mystery will pass on to someone else, and the cycle will continue as it has for thousands of years. Either way, the forest will still be here. The clearing will still be here. The stone and the symbols and the whistle will still be here, waiting for the next curious soul who wanders too far from the trail and finds themselves caught in something they do not understand. If that soul is you, I hope this account helps you somehow. I hope it gives you the information you need to make your choice with open eyes, understanding the true nature of what is being offered. I hope it prepares you for what you will see and hear and feel when you step into that clearing and face the presence that waits there. But more than anything, I hope you never find it at all. I hope you live a normal, boring life, full of ordinary joys and ordinary sorrows, never knowing what lurks in the depths of certain forests, in the spaces between the trees where the light does not reach. I hope the symbol means nothing to you. The whistle is just the wind, and this story is just a story, a piece of entertainment to be consumed and forgotten. That would be the best outcome, truly. Ignorance is not just bliss, sometimes. It is survival. But if you have read this far, something tells me that ignorance is not an option for you. Something tells me that you have felt the pull, heard the call, sensed the presence that watches from the shadows. Something tells me that the forest has already marked you, just as it marked me, just as it has marked countless others over the millennia. In that case, all I can say is this: be careful, be cautious. Be aware that the choice you are facing is not what it appears to be. The presence in the clearing is old and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. It does not think the way we think, does not value what we value, does not understand concepts like mercy or kindness or love. It offers what it offers, and it takes what it takes, and the transaction is never as simple as it seems. Choose wisely. That is all the advice I have. Choose wisely, and if you can, choose to walk away. I wish I could tell you that I have followed my own advice. I wish I could tell you that I am at peace, that I have accepted my fate, that I look back on my life with no regrets. But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that I am still fighting, still struggling, still trying to hold on to the fragments of humanity that the forest has been slowly eroding for the past 50 years. Some days I win, some days I lose. Most days, it is a draw. But I am still here. I am still me, Thomas Whitmore, forest ranger, husband, father, grandfather, survivor. I am still the 14-year-old boy who stumbled into a clearing and found something that defied explanation. I am still the man who said no to an offer that many would consider irresistible. I am still fighting. That has to count for something. The whistle is growing louder now, and the sun has fully set, and the darkness is creeping across my porch like a living thing. I should go inside, lock the door, pretend that the night outside is just a night and nothing more. I should pour myself a drink, kiss my wife, watch television until my eyes grow heavy and sleep overtakes me. I should live my life as if the clearing and the stone and the presence do not exist, as if this is all just a story I made up to frighten myself on long winter evenings. But I will not do any of those things. Not tonight. Tonight, I think I will sit on this porch and listen to the whistle and remember my sister's face. Her real face, not the mask the forest made, and think about all the choices that brought me to this moment. I will remember Samuel Blackwood and Margaret Hollins and David Chen and all the others who found the clearing and never came back. I will remember Amanda Chen, brilliant and curious, who followed the truth too far and paid the price for her dedication. And I will wonder, as I have wondered every night for the past 47 years, what it would be like to finally say yes, to stop fighting, stop resisting, stop holding on to a humanity that feels increasingly like a burden. To surrender to the forest and become part of something vast and eternal and utterly beyond human comprehension. I will not do it tonight. I am almost certain of that. But tomorrow is another day, and the day after that, and the day after that, stretching on into a future that grows darker with each passing hour. The whistle is patient, and so is the thing that makes it. They have all the time in the world. I do not. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. Not the clearing or the stone or the presence that waits in the silence. Not the disappeared hikers or the ancient journals or the symbols carved into trees throughout the forest. Not even my sister's face, frozen forever at 11 years old, staring at me with eyes that held no recognition. No, the most terrifying truth is simply this. Time is running out. For me, for all of us, for everything we think we know and love. The forest is patient because it is eternal, and we are not. Sooner or later, the whistle will call us home, and we will have to answer. I hope when that moment comes that I have the courage to make the same choice I made 6 months ago. I hope I have the strength to say no one final time, to die as Thomas Whitmore rather than becoming whatever the forest would make of me. I hope my life has meaning beyond the mystery that has consumed it, that my children and grandchildren will remember me as more than the strange old man who spent his life chasing shadows in the woods. But hope is a fragile thing, and the night is very long, and the whistle is calling. It is always calling. I should tell you what happened to the others, the ones who disappeared after I returned to Black Hollow as a ranger. I owe them that much, at least. The acknowledgement that their stories are part of my story, that their fates are tangled up with mine in ways I cannot fully explain. James Morrison, the first to vanish after my return, was never found. His family hired private investigators, consulted psychics, even brought in a team from one of those paranormal television shows that were popular in the early 2000s. Nothing. His campsite became a minor attraction for a while, visited by the morbidly curious, but eventually the forest reclaimed it, and now there is no sign he was ever there. His mother still sends me letters sometimes, asking if there have been any developments. I always write back with the same answer, I am sorry, but there is nothing new to report. The Thompson family, Mark, Jennifer, and their 2 children, became something of a legend in these parts. Their disappearance was covered by national news outlets, sparked conspiracy theories involving everything from alien abduction to witness protection programs. The official investigation dragged on for years, turning up nothing but dead ends and false leads. I know the truth, or at least I know more of it than anyone else. But what good would it do to tell them? What could I say that would bring them comfort? Your loved ones walked into a clearing in the woods and became part of something ancient and unknowable. Would that help them sleep at night? Amanda Chen is the one I think about most often. She came so close to understanding, closer than anyone I had encountered in my decades of research. Her dissertation, which was never completed, outlined a theory that the indigenous peoples of this region had known about the clearings for thousands of years, had developed rituals and taboos designed to protect their communities from the presence within. She had found patterns in their oral traditions, connections that no one else had made, a framework for understanding that might have changed everything. But she went into the forest alone, and now her insights are lost, just like all the others. I took her notebooks, the ones I found at her campsite, and added them to my collection. I have read them so many times that I have memorized passages, can recite them from memory, like scripture. She was brilliant, Amanda, and she was brave, and she deserved better than what she got. Sometimes I imagine what might have happened if she had come to me before venturing into the woods, if I had told her everything I knew instead of parceling out information in careful increments. Maybe we could have worked together, maybe we could have figured it out, or maybe she would have disappeared anyway, and I would have followed her into the darkness, and both of our stories would have ended in that clearing. The forest does not care about brilliance or bravery. It takes what it wants. I should tell you about my family. I have mentioned my wife and children in passing, but they deserve more than that. They are the reason I am still here, the anchor that keeps me tethered to the human world when the pull of the forest grows too strong. My wife's name is Sarah, and I met her when I was 32 years old, working at a national forest in Washington state. She was a botanist doing research on old-growth ecosystems, and I was assigned to assist her team during their fieldwork. She was smart and funny and completely unimpressed by the brooding, mysterious persona I had cultivated over the years. She saw through me immediately, recognized the damaged child beneath the adult exterior, and instead of running away, she stuck around to help me pick up the pieces. I told her about Emily early in our relationship. Not everything, but enough for her to understand why I was the way I was. She listened without judgment, held me when the tears came, and never once suggested that I was crazy or delusional. She believed me, or at least she believed that I believed, and that was enough. We got married in 1993 and had 2 children. Michael, born in 1995, and Catherine, born in 1998. I tried to be a good father to them, present in a way my own father had never been. But I know there were times when I failed. The nightmares never stopped, and sometimes I would disappear into my research for days at a time, emerging wild-eyed and distant, unable to explain where I had been or what I had been doing. My children learned to live with this, adapted to their father's eccentricities, but I can see in their eyes sometimes a wariness that breaks my heart. They do not know the full story. Sarah knows more than anyone else, but even she has not read the journals, or seen the maps, or heard my account of what happened in the clearing 6 months ago. I have kept those secrets close, not because I do not trust my family, but because I am afraid of what the knowledge might do to them. The truth is a burden, and I have carried it long enough to know how heavy it can become. My son Michael is 30 years old now, married with a child of his own. A little girl named Emma who calls me Grandpa Tom and thinks I am the most interesting person in the world because I work in the forest and know all about animals and trees. I look at her sometimes and feel a fear so profound that it takes my breath away. She is so innocent, so full of wonder and curiosity, exactly the kind of person the forest likes to claim. I have made Sarah promise that Emma will never visit Black Hollow, that she will be kept far away from the shadows of my past. Sarah agreed without question, though I saw the concern in her eyes. My daughter Catherine lives in California and works as a marine biologist, about as far from forests as one can get. I do not think this is a coincidence. She has always been sensitive, attuned to things that others miss, and I suspect she has felt the presence of my secrets, even if she does not know their nature. She calls me every Sunday, asks about my health and my work, carefully avoids any topics that might lead us into uncomfortable territory. I love her for that caution, even as it saddens me. I wish I could tell them everything. I wish I could sit them down and explain why their father has spent his life the way he has, why he has made the choices he has made, why he carries a weight they cannot see. But some truths are too heavy to share, and this is one of them. I will take my secrets to the grave or to the clearing, whichever comes first. Let me tell you about the old ranger. When I first came to Black Hollow in 2007, the senior ranger was a man named Harold Bishop. He was 73 years old, had been working in this forest for nearly 4 decades, and was planning to retire within the year. I was hired to replace him, though the transition period was supposed to be longer than it turned out to be. Harold was a strange man, quiet, withdrawn, with eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He did his job competently enough, but there was something absent about him, as if part of his mind was always somewhere else. The other rangers whispered about him, exchanged theories about what had made him this way. Some said it was the isolation. Some said it was trauma from his time in Vietnam. Some said he was just naturally odd, a hermit by temperament who had found the perfect profession for his disposition. I knew better almost immediately. I recognized the look in his eyes because I had seen it in the mirror. One evening, about 2 weeks after my arrival, Harold invited me to his cabin for dinner. It was an unusual gesture. He was not known for socializing, and I accepted with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. His cabin was at the edge of the forest, similar to the one where I had spent that terrible summer as a child, and as I approached it in the gathering darkness, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. We ate in silence, a simple meal of canned beans and cornbread, and when the plates were cleared, Harold poured 2 glasses of whiskey and sat down across from me with an expression I could not read. He asked me why I had come to Black Hollow. Not for the job, he said, for the real reason. I could have lied. I should have lied. But something in his eyes told me that he would know, that he had spent too many years in this forest to be fooled by comfortable deceptions. So I told him the truth. About Emily, about the clearing, about the decades I had spent trying to understand what had happened to me as a child. I told him about the journals and the symbols and the presence that called to me in my dreams. When I finished, Harold nodded slowly and poured himself another whiskey. He said, "I found it in 1974. Over the next hour, he told me his story. He had come to Black Hollow as a young man, fresh out of the service, looking for peace and solitude after the horrors of war. For years, the forest had given him what he needed, a quiet place to heal, a purpose that asked nothing of him but competence and dedication. And then, one autumn evening, he had heard the whistle. His account was remarkably similar to mine. The symbols, the clearing, the stone structure, the presence that watched from the silence. He had found his own collection of journals over the years, compared notes with previous rangers who had experienced the same thing. There was a pattern, he said, a cycle that repeated every few decades. The forest would go quiet for years at a time, dormant, and then something would wake it up, and the disappearances would begin again. He did not know what triggered the awakenings. He did not know why some people found the clearing and others did not. He did not know what happened to those who were taken, whether they died or were transformed or simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. He had spent decades searching for answers and found nothing but more questions. But he knew one thing: the presence in the clearing was not evil. It was not malevolent in any human sense. It was simply other, a form of existence so different from our own that we lacked the conceptual framework to understand it. It took people because that was its nature, the same way a river takes debris that falls into its current. There was no malice involved, no judgment. It was just doing what it did. I asked him why he had stayed, why he had not left this place and never looked back. He smiled, a sad and knowing expression, and said, "Where else would I go?" He understood, as I would come to understand, that once the forest marks you, there is no escaping it. You can run to the other side of the world, build a new life, pretend that none of it ever happened. But the dreams will follow you, and the whistle will find you. And sooner or later, you will wake up in the middle of the night and realize that you have been walking toward the trees in your sleep. Better to stay, he said. Better to keep watch, to warn those who can be warned, to bear witness to what happens here. It is not much of a purpose, but it is something. Harold died 3 months after our conversation. His heart gave out while he was on patrol, and by the time we found him, he had been dead for nearly a day. I was the one who discovered his body, sitting against a tree at the edge of the forest, his eyes open and staring at the sky, a faint smile on his face. I like to think he was at peace in those final moments. I like to think the forest gave him that much, after everything he had sacrificed. But I cannot be certain, and the uncertainty haunts me. I took his journals after he died, added them to my collection. His insights were invaluable, filling in gaps in my own understanding, confirming theories I had developed over the years. But more than that, they gave me comfort. They told me that I was not alone, that others had walked this path before me, that the burden I carried was not mine alone. I have never felt more alone than when I realized how much company I had. The years have passed, and the forest has continued its cycle of dormancy and awakening. The disappearances come and go, and the investigations turn up nothing, and the world moves on, forgetting what happened here until it happens again. I have watched this pattern repeat 3 times now, each time hoping it will be the last, each time knowing it will not be. I am older now, as I have said, 61 years old, with all the limitations that implies. My knees ache when I walk too far. My eyesight is not what it used to be. My memories are beginning to blur at the edges, the sharp details of my youth softening into impressions and emotions. I do not have many years left, and I can feel the forest watching me, waiting to see what I will do with the time I have remaining. The whistle calls more frequently now. I hear it almost every night, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud that I am certain Sarah must hear it too. But she never does. The sound is for me alone, a personal invitation that no one else can perceive. It is getting harder to resist, harder to remember why I said no in the first place. There are moments, late at night, when I consider simply walking into the trees and never coming back. It would be so easy. A few hours of hiking, a clearing that I know as well as I know my own home, a choice that has been waiting for me since I was 14 years old. I would not have to fight anymore, would not have to carry the weight of all these secrets, would not have to watch the people I love grow old and die while I wait for a resolution that never comes. But then the morning arrives, and the sun rises over the mountains, and I remember why I chose to stay. I remember Sarah's face, my children's faces, my granddaughter's laughter echoing through our home. I remember that there is more to life than mysteries and fears, that the human world, for all its limitations, has beauty and meaning and love. And I choose, one more time, to be part of that world instead of the other one. I do not know how many more times I will be able to make that choice. The pull is growing stronger, and my resistance is growing weaker, and there is a voice in my head that whispers constantly, telling me that I have held on long enough, that I deserve to rest, that the forest is not a prison, but a home I have never allowed myself to enter. Maybe the voice is right. Maybe the truth I have been fighting all these years is not that the forest is evil, but that it offers something I have always secretly wanted. Release from the burden of being human, escape from the limitations of mortal existence, a chance to become part of something vast and eternal and utterly free. Or maybe the voice is lying, telling me what I want to hear in order to draw me in, and what waits in the clearing is not peace but oblivion, not transformation but annihilation. I do not know. After 50 years of searching, I still do not know. That is the truth I want to leave you with, the honest answer to the question you have been asking since you started reading this account. What is in the forest? What is the presence in the clearing? What happened to Emily and Samuel and Margaret and David and Amanda and all the others who followed the whistle into the darkness? I do not know. I have theories, gathered from decades of research and observation. I have insights, derived from the journals of those who came before me and never returned. I have experiences, personal encounters with something that defies rational explanation. But knowledge? Certainty? The ability to say with confidence what is real and what is imagined, what is danger and what is opportunity, what is loss and what is transformation? No, I have none of those things. The mystery remains. The questions remain. The forest remains, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human curiosity. And I remain, for now, standing at the edge, staring into the darkness, wondering what would happen if I finally took that last step. Maybe someday I will find out. Maybe someday the whistle will call and I will answer, and everything I have wondered about will become clear. Until then, I will keep watch. I will protect the forest and the people who visit it. I will add new journals to my collection and new entries to my maps. I will dream of Emily and remember my parents and love my family with whatever capacity I have left for love. And I will wait for the choice that is always waiting, the door that is always open, the presence that is always watching. That is my story. That is all I have to tell. But the forest has more stories than mine. Thousands of them, millions of them, stretching back to a time before humans walked this earth. If you listen carefully, late at night, when the world is quiet and the boundaries between reality and something else grow thin, you might hear them. Just be careful what you do when you hear the whistle. It knows your name too. As I finish writing these words, I realize that I have left something out. Not intentionally, but because it is the hardest thing to put into language. It is not about the clearing or the symbols or the disappearances. It is about the dreams. I have mentioned the dreams several times throughout this account, but I have not described them in detail. There is a reason for that. The dreams are difficult to convey in words, not because they are vague or fragmentary, but because they are too real, too vivid, too present. They are not like normal dreams, the kind you forget within minutes of waking. They are experiences, complete and coherent, that leave me shaking and exhausted when they finally release me. In the dreams, I am in the forest, not the forest I know from my daily patrols, the forest of trails and waymarks and human intervention. This is the forest as it exists beneath the surface, the true forest, ancient and vast and utterly wild. The trees are larger here, their trunks wider than buildings, their canopies so thick that no light reaches the ground. The air is heavy with moisture and decay, and the smell is overwhelming. Earth and rot and something else, something alive and breathing in the darkness. I walk through this forest, following paths that appear and disappear as I move, and I know with dream certainty that I am not alone. There are things in the shadows, watching me, keeping pace. I catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shapes that might be human and might not, figures that seem to flicker in and out of existence. They do not approach, do not threaten. They just watch. The path always leads to the clearing. No matter which direction I walk, no matter how many times I turn away, I eventually emerge from the trees into that terrible open space. The stone structure is waiting, the symbols glowing faintly in the darkness, and the presence is there, pressing against my mind like a weight I cannot lift. In the early years, the dreams ended here. I would stand before the stone and feel the presence, and then wake up, gasping and sweating, my heart pounding in my chest. But over time, the dreams have progressed, gone further, shown me things I did not want to see. I have seen the others, not just Emily and the hikers who disappeared. All the others, the thousands who have found this place over the centuries. They are in the clearing, standing in circles around the stone, their eyes closed, their faces peaceful. They are young and old, men and women and children, dressed in clothing from every era of human history. They do not speak or move. They simply exist, preserved in whatever state they were in when they were taken, waiting for something I cannot understand. Emily is among them. I see her every time, standing near the center of the circle, her purple unicorn shirt faded but intact. She does not recognize me. She does not respond when I call her name. She is there and not there, present but absent, a photograph frozen in time. In the most recent dreams, the ones that have been coming more frequently over the past 6 months, I have begun to join them. I feel myself moving toward the circle, feel my feet carrying me forward despite my attempts to resist. I feel the presence pressing into my mind, reshaping my thoughts, preparing me for something I cannot name. And just before I reach the circle, just before I become one of them, I wake up. But the waking comes later each time. The resistance grows weaker. The moment of joining grows closer. I do not know what it means. I do not know if the dreams are predictions or warnings or simply the products of a traumatized mind trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. But I know that they are changing, that something is shifting, that the barrier between sleeping and waking is growing thinner with each passing night. Maybe this is how it ends for all of us, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a choice that feels like a choice, but with a gradual erosion of the self until there is nothing left to resist. Maybe the forest does not take us. Maybe we simply stop existing in the way we used to exist, and what remains is something that belongs to the trees and the symbols and the presence in the silence. If that is true, then maybe I have already made my choice. Maybe I made it when I was 14 years old, when I reached out and touched that first carved symbol, when I felt the chill run through my body and knew that something had noticed me. Maybe everything since then has just been the slow unfolding of a decision I made without realizing what I was deciding. Or maybe there is still time. Maybe the dreams are showing me what could happen so that I can choose differently, so that I can break the pattern that has been repeating for millennia. Maybe I am not just a victim of the forest, but an agent, someone with the power to change the story rather than just continue it. I want to believe that. I need to believe that. Because if I cannot change anything, if all my years of research and resistance have been nothing but a delaying action, then what has been the point? What have I lived for? The whistle is calling again, louder than ever. Sarah is asleep upstairs, unaware of the sound that fills the night. The forest is waiting at the edge of the clearing, the trees dark silhouettes against a sky full of stars. And I am here, at my desk, writing these final words, trying to make sense of something that has never made sense and never will. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to close this document and save it and put it in the place where I have arranged for it to be found. And then I am going to do something I have never done before. I am going to answer the whistle, not to accept what is being offered, not to join the circle of the lost. I am going to answer it to confront it, to demand answers, to force some kind of resolution after 50 years of waiting. I am going to walk into that forest and find the clearing and stand before the presence that has haunted my life, and I am going to ask it what it wants, why it chose me, what happened to my sister and all the others. Maybe it will kill me, maybe it will take me the way it took Emily, and I will become one of those frozen figures in my dreams. Maybe this is a terrible mistake, the kind of thing I have been warning others against for decades, but I have to know. After all these years, I have to know something, even if the knowing destroys me. This is Thomas Whitmore, signing off. If you are reading this, then I did not come back, and the document has been released according to my instructions. I hope it has been useful. I hope it has given you something, knowledge, warning, comfort, I do not know what. I hope my story has meaning beyond the telling, that it serves some purpose I cannot foresee. Take care of yourselves, be careful in the forest, and if you hear the whistle, remember what I told you. It knows your name. It has always known your name, and sooner or later, it will call. Goodbye. The night swallows me as I step off the porch and begin walking toward the trees. The whistle grows louder, a melody I have known for half a century, a song that has been waiting for me to dance. The forest opens before me, a darkness that is not empty but full, teeming with things I cannot see but can feel. I am afraid. I have never been more afraid in my life, but I am also ready. Whatever happens next, whatever I find in that clearing, I will face it with my eyes open and my heart steady. I have earned that much. I have paid enough in fear. The trees close behind me, and the world I knew disappears, and there is only the path ahead, winding through shadows toward a destination I have been approaching since I was 14 years old. The clearing is waiting, the presence is waiting, and I am finally going to meet it. I was part of a search team for a missing child. Something else was in those woods. The little girl had been missing for 3 days when we found her shoes. They were pink sneakers with cartoon rabbits on the sides, placed neatly together at the base of a pine tree, laces still tied. No mud, no scuff marks, no sign of struggle. Just 2 small shoes arranged with impossible care in the middle of Blackwood Ridge, 14 miles from where 7-year-old Emma Hartley had vanished from her family's campsite. I have been a ranger at Blackwood Ridge National Forest for 11 years. I have seen hikers succumb to hypothermia within sight of the trailhead. I have recovered bodies from ravines so deep the sunlight never touches the bottom. I have told more families than I can count that their loved ones will not be coming home. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened during that search, and nothing since has allowed me to forget it. My name is Marcus Cole, and I need you to understand that everything I am about to tell you is true. I know how it sounds. I know that some of you will think I have lost my mind, and maybe you are right. Maybe the forest finally took something from me that I will never get back. But I also know that there are others out there who have seen things in places like Blackwood Ridge, things that do not fit neatly into any category of animal or weather phenomenon or tragic accident. This story is for them. This story is for anyone who has ever stood in the deep woods and felt, with absolute certainty, that they were being watched by something that should not exist. It started on a Friday in late October, the kind of day when the forest seems to hold its breath. The leaves had already turned, and the canopy blazed with red and gold, but there was a heaviness in the air that made my bones ache. I was finishing up some paperwork at the main station when dispatch patched through an emergency call from the Hartley family campsite at Bear Creek, Section 9. A child was missing. I grabbed my pack and was out the door before the call ended. Section 9 is about 12 miles northeast of the station, accessible by a single dirt road that winds through some of the most isolated terrain in the entire park. The Hartley family had reserved the site for a weekend trip, parents and 2 kids looking to disconnect from the world and enjoy some quality time in nature. They had no way of knowing that Blackwood Ridge does not let go of the things it takes. When I arrived at the campsite, the scene was chaos. Sarah Hartley was screaming into the trees, her voice already hoarse from hours of calling her daughter's name. Her husband, Tom, was pacing the perimeter of their tent, running his hands through his hair over and over like a man trying to wake himself from a nightmare. Their son, a boy of about 10 named Daniel, sat on a cooler with his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the ground with the hollow expression of someone who has just witnessed the impossible. I approached Tom first, keeping my voice calm and professional. I asked him to walk me through what happened. His account was fragmented, interrupted by long pauses and sudden bursts of frantic energy, but I pieced together the essential details. Emma had been playing near the creek while her parents prepared lunch. The water was shallow, barely ankle deep, and they could see her from the picnic table. She was collecting rocks, filling her pockets with smooth stones the way children do. Sarah had looked away for maybe 30 seconds to check on the sandwiches. When she looked back, Emma was gone. Not wandering off, not walking toward the trees. Gone. Sarah ran to the creek immediately. She searched the water, the banks, the underbrush. She screamed Emma's name until her throat burned. Tom joined her, and together they combed every inch of ground within 100 yards of the campsite. Nothing. No footprints leading away, no broken branches, no response to their calls. It was as if the forest had opened up and swallowed their daughter whole. I radioed for backup and began organizing a preliminary search pattern. 2 more rangers arrived within the hour, along with a volunteer coordinator from the county search and rescue team. By nightfall, we had 23 people on the ground, moving through the woods in a grid formation with flashlights and whistles, and the desperate hope that we would find Emma Hartley huddled under a log somewhere, scared but alive. We searched until 2 in the morning. We found nothing. The second day brought helicopters and tracking dogs and a media presence that turned the main parking lot into a circus of satellite trucks and concerned reporters. I barely noticed any of it. My focus was on the forest, on the subtle wrongness that I had begun to feel in my gut every time I stepped past the tree line. I have spent most of my adult life in these woods. I know their rhythms, their sounds, their moods. I know how the wind moves through the pines at different times of day. I know which birds sing at dawn and which fall silent when a storm is coming. But during those first 2 days of searching for Emma Hartley, the forest felt different. It felt watchful. It felt hungry. The tracking dogs were the first sign that something was deeply wrong. We had brought in 2 experienced bloodhounds from the state police, animals that had successfully located dozens of missing persons over the years. Their handler, a grizzled veteran named Pete Womack, gave them Emma's pillowcase to scent and let them loose near the creek where she had last been seen. They refused to track. I had never seen anything like it. These dogs were trained to follow a human scent through rain, through snow, through terrain so rough it would break a lesser animal. But at Bear Creek, they simply sat down and whined. Pete tried everything. He encouraged them, commanded them, practically begged them to work. They would not move. They just stared into the trees with their ears flat against their skulls and made sounds I had never heard a dog make before, sounds that were closer to crying than barking. Pete finally gave up and loaded them back into his truck. Before he left, he pulled me aside and said something that has haunted me ever since. "Those dogs have tracked through crime scenes that would make your stomach turn," he told me. "They have never refused a scent. Whatever happened to that little girl, whatever took her, it scared them so bad they would rather die than follow it." I wanted to tell him he was being dramatic. I wanted to chalk it up to some environmental factor, some chemical in the water or unusual animal musk that had confused their senses. But deep down, I knew he was right. Something was wrong in Blackwood Ridge, something that went beyond a simple missing persons case. On the morning of the 3rd day, I decided to search a section of the forest that we had not yet covered. It was an area known locally as the Hollows, a dense stretch of old-growth timber about 3 miles north of the campsite. Most of the other searchers avoided the hollows because the terrain was treacherous and the canopy so thick that radio signals became unreliable. But I had a feeling, a crawling certainty in my spine, that Emma Hartley had been taken in that direction. I told my supervisor I was going to sweep the northern perimeter. I did not tell him I was planning to go into the hollows alone. He would have stopped me if he knew, and I could not let that happen. Something was pulling me toward those trees, some instinct that I could not explain or ignore. The forest changed as I moved deeper into the hollows. The deciduous trees gave way to massive pines and ancient oaks, their trunks so wide that 3 men linking arms could not encircle them. The ground was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, soft and silent beneath my boots. The canopy blocked out most of the morning light, leaving me in a permanent twilight that made it difficult to judge the passage of time. I had been walking for about an hour when I found the first marker. It was a small pile of stones, maybe a dozen of them, stacked in a perfect pyramid at the base of a rotting stump. The stones were smooth and round, the kind you might find in a riverbed or along the shore of a lake, the kind a 7-year-old girl might collect while playing near a creek. My heart began to pound. I scanned the surrounding trees, looking for any sign of movement, any flash of color that might be a little girl's jacket or shirt. There was nothing. Just the endless ranks of silent timber and the oppressive weight of the watching forest. I marked the location on my GPS and kept moving. 50 yards further, I found another stone pile, then another, then another. They formed a trail leading deeper into the hollows, each one placed with the same meticulous care, each one impossible for a lost child to have constructed while simultaneously fleeing whatever had taken her, unless she was not fleeing, unless she was being led. The thought made my blood run cold, but I forced myself to keep following the trail. The stone piles continued for nearly a mile, winding through the trees in a pattern that seemed almost ceremonial, almost ritualistic. And then, in a small clearing surrounded by the largest oaks I had ever seen, I found the shoes. Pink sneakers with cartoon rabbits on the sides. Laces still tied. No mud. No scuff marks. Placed neatly together at the base of a pine tree, as if Emma Hartley had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into the wilderness. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be an explanation, that children do strange things when they are scared and lost, that the stone piles and the arranged shoes were just the random actions of a confused little girl. But another part of me, the part that had felt the wrongness in the forest from the very beginning, knew that I was looking at something else entirely. I knew that I was looking at a message. I called it in immediately, requesting backup and a forensic team to process the scene. While I waited, I examined the clearing more closely, being careful not to disturb any potential evidence. That was when I noticed the tree. It was an oak, one of the ancient giants that ringed the clearing. But there was something different about this one. Its bark was covered in marks, hundreds of them, scratched into the wood at varying heights from ground level to well over my head. At first, I thought they were claw marks from a bear or some other large animal, but as I looked closer, I realized they were too regular, too deliberate. They were symbols. I did not recognize the language or the alphabet. The marks were angular and harsh, like something carved in a hurry by hands that were not quite human. Some of them overlapped, suggesting they had been added over a long period of time, possibly years or even decades. And at the center of the pattern, surrounded by a spiral of increasingly frantic scratches, was a single word carved in English. Hello. I stepped back from the tree, my hand instinctively moving to the sidearm on my belt. The forest was completely silent now. No birds, no wind, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of something waiting to see what I would do next. I looked down at my feet. The ground in the clearing was covered with the same carpet of pine needles as the rest of the hollows, but now that I was paying attention, I could see that there was a slight depression in the center, a shallow bowl that suggested something underneath. I knelt down and brushed away the needles with my hand. Beneath them I found wood, old wood, gray and weathered and split in places, but unmistakably the planks of a trapdoor. Every instinct I had screamed at me to wait for backup. I was alone in an unfamiliar part of the forest. Radio contact was spotty at best, and I had just discovered evidence suggesting that Emma Hartley's disappearance was connected to something far more sinister than a simple wandering off. Opening that trap door alone was exactly the kind of decision that gets rangers killed. But I also knew that a 7-year-old girl had been missing for 3 days, and every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding her alive. If she was down there, if she was still breathing, I could not afford to wait. I cleared away the rest of the pine needles and examined the trap door. It was about 3 feet square, held shut by a simple wooden latch that showed no signs of rust or rot. Someone had been maintaining it. Someone had been using it recently. I drew my sidearm, clicked off the safety, and pulled open the door. The smell hit me first, a thick wave of decay and dampness and something else, something organic and wrong that I could not identify. I gagged and had to turn away for a moment, breathing through my mouth until the initial assault faded. Then I pulled out my flashlight and pointed it down into the darkness. Stone steps descended into the earth, rough-hewn and ancient, disappearing into a blackness that my light could not penetrate. The walls of the shaft were lined with the same angular symbols I had seen on the tree, carved so deeply into the rock that they cast sharp shadows in the beam of my flashlight. And at the edge of my vision, just barely visible at the bottom of the stairs, I saw something that made my heart stop. A small hand, pale and motionless, reaching up from the darkness as if asking for help. I did not think. I did not hesitate. I started down the stairs with my weapon raised and my flashlight cutting through the black, calling Emma's name with every step. The smell grew stronger as I descended, and the temperature dropped until I could see my breath misting in the air. The walls pressed in around me, narrowing the passage until I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. And then, after what felt like an eternity of descending, I reached the bottom. The hand belonged to a doll. It was an old thing, porcelain and cloth, dressed in a faded blue dress that might have been pretty 50 years ago. It lay on the floor of a small chamber, its painted face staring up at the ceiling with an expression of frozen surprise. Around it, arranged in a careful circle, were dozens of other objects. Toys and clothes and photographs and jewelry, personal items spanning what looked like generations, all placed with the same meticulous attention as the stone piles I had followed through the forest. I swept my flashlight around the chamber, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The walls were covered in more symbols, but these were different from the ones above. They were larger, more elaborate, and they seemed to move in the flickering light, shifting and writhing like living things. In the center of the far wall, carved into the stone with terrible precision, was a figure. It was tall and thin, impossibly so, with limbs that bent at angles that no human body could achieve. Its head was featureless, except for a wide, curved line that might have been a mouth, stretched in a smile that contained too many teeth. Its hands, if they could be called hands, ended in fingers that were too long and too sharp, reaching out from the wall as if trying to grab anyone who stood too close. I had seen that figure before, not in person, not in any official report or wildlife documentation. I had seen it in the drawings that children sometimes made after spending time in certain parts of Blackwood Ridge. Crude crayon sketches of a tall, thin man who lived in the trees, who watched them while they played, who whispered their names when no one else was listening. We always dismiss those drawings as imagination, as the product of young minds processing the natural fear that deep forests inspire. We never considered that the children might be drawing something real. I backed toward the stairs, my weapon still raised, my flashlight sweeping the chamber for any sign of movement. That was when I heard it, a sound that came from deeper in the darkness, from a passage I had not noticed at the far end of the room. It was a voice, high and thin, and achingly familiar. "Mr. Ranger, is that you?" It was Emma Hartley. I ran toward the sound, all thoughts of backup and procedure and personal safety abandoned in the desperate need to reach that child. The passage twisted and turned, narrowing in places until I had to crawl on my hands and knees, widening in others into chambers filled with more of those terrible offerings. The voice kept calling to me. Always just ahead, always just out of reach. "Mr. Ranger, I am so scared. Please help me. Please find me." I followed it for what felt like hours, though my watch told me it was only minutes. The passage sloped downward, taking me deeper into the earth than I would have thought possible. The symbols on the walls grew denser, more frantic, as if whoever had carved them was running out of time or space or sanity. And then, finally, I emerged into a cavern so vast that my flashlight could not find the far wall. The floor was covered in bones, not animal bones, human bones. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the stone in drifts like autumn leaves. Skulls grinned up at me from the darkness. Rib cages lay open like flowers. Small bones, child-sized bones, were arranged in patterns that matched the symbols on the walls. In the center of the cavern, standing perfectly still in a shaft of light that seemed to come from nowhere, was Emma Hartley. She was alive. She was unharmed. She was smiling. And behind her, rising from the shadows like smoke taking form, was the thing from the carving. It was taller than I had imagined, so tall that its head disappeared into the darkness above. Its body was wrong in ways that my mind refused to fully process. Angles and proportions that should not exist in any creature that walked or crawled or flew. Its skin, if it was skin, was the gray of old bark, rough and textured and covered in those same angular symbols that I had seen throughout the tunnels. And its face, that terrible featureless face with its too wide smile, was turned directly toward me. I raised my weapon and fired. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off the walls until they sounded like a continuous roar. I emptied the entire magazine into that thing. 14 rounds of hollow point ammunition that would have dropped any living creature in its tracks. It did not move. It did not react. It simply stood there, that impossible smile never wavering, those long fingers still reaching toward me across the sea of bones. And then Emma spoke again. "He wants to show you something, Mr. Ranger. He wants to show you what happens to the ones who come looking." The light in the cavern began to fade. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating and alive. I could feel it touching me, sliding across my skin like cold water, probing at my eyes and ears and mouth. I could hear voices in it, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all whispering the same words over and over. "Stay with us, stay with us, stay with us." I do not remember running. I do not remember the passage or the chamber or the stairs. My next clear memory is of bursting out of the trap door into the clearing, gasping for air, my empty weapon still clutched in my shaking hand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that looked too much like fire. I ran until I found a spot where my radio worked, and I called for immediate evacuation. I told them I had found evidence of Emma Hartley's location, but that the scene was too dangerous to process without additional personnel. I told them I needed helicopters and search teams and every available ranger in the district. I did not tell them what I had seen in that cavern. I did not tell them about the bones or the symbols or the thing that had stood behind a smiling 7-year-old girl in a shaft of impossible light. Some things cannot be put into an official report. Some things would end your career the moment you spoke them aloud. The backup arrived within the hour. We returned to the clearing in force. A dozen armed rangers with powerful lights and enough firepower to stop a charging bear. But when we opened the trapdoor, we found nothing. The stairs were gone. The chamber was gone. The passage was gone. There was only solid earth beneath those weathered planks, packed clay and rock that showed no sign of ever having been disturbed. I tried to explain. I tried to show them the symbols on the tree, the stone piles I had followed through the forest. But the tree was bare, its bark smooth and unmarked. The stone piles had vanished. Even Emma's shoes were gone, leaving nothing but a shallow depression in the pine needles where they had been. The search for Emma Hartley continued for 2 more weeks. We covered every inch of Blackwood Ridge, from the developed campgrounds to the most remote wilderness areas. We brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment. We interviewed every person who had visited the park in the month before her disappearance. We found nothing. Emma Hartley was never seen again. The official report lists her as a presumed drowning, carried away by the creek during an unexpected flash flood that we have no evidence ever occurred. Her parents eventually moved away, broken by grief and the lack of closure. Her brother Daniel stopped speaking entirely and had to be institutionalized. The media lost interest after a few months, moving on to newer tragedies and fresher horrors. But I never stopped thinking about what I saw in that cavern. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had let the darkness wrap around me and pull me down into whatever hell lay beneath Blackwood Ridge. I started researching. Quietly at first, just looking through old case files and newspaper archives, searching for any mention of similar disappearances in the area. What I found was worse than I had imagined. Emma Hartley was not the first child to vanish from Blackwood Ridge. She was not even the first that year. Over the past century, more than 40 people had disappeared within the boundaries of the park, most of them children, most of them from the same general area around Bear Creek and the Hollows. The cases stretched back to the earliest records we had, to handwritten reports from rangers who patrolled these woods when they were still untamed wilderness. And in several of those reports, buried in the descriptions of search patterns and witness interviews, I found references to something that made my blood run cold. A tall, thin figure seen at the edge of the tree line, strange symbols carved into rocks and trees, offerings left in remote clearings, toys and clothes and personal items arranged with impossible care. The thing in the cavern had been hunting in Blackwood Ridge for over 100 years. I tried to bring my findings to the park superintendent, to anyone who would listen. I was told that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress, that the failure to find Emma Hartley had affected my judgment, that I needed to take some time off and speak with a counselor. When I persisted, I was put on administrative leave and strongly encouraged to consider early retirement. I refused. I could not leave, not knowing what I knew, not with that thing still out there waiting for its next victim. I started spending my off-duty hours in the forest, searching for the clearing, searching for any trace of the tunnels I had discovered. I never found them. It was as if the earth itself had healed over, erasing all evidence of what lay beneath. But I did find other things. I found stone piles in places where no one should have been. I found symbols scratched into bark, faint and fresh and growing more numerous with each passing week. I found toys left at the base of trees, modern toys, plastic action figures and stuffed animals and electronic devices that still had battery power. Something was still taking offerings. Something was still being fed. And then, 6 months after Emma Hartley disappeared, another child went missing. His name was Michael Torres, 8 years old, visiting the park with his scout troop for a weekend camping trip. He vanished from his tent in the middle of the night, leaving behind nothing but a single shoe and the lingering smell of pine needles and decay. I was not officially part of the search team. I had been placed on restricted duty, confined to paperwork and administrative tasks while my mental fitness was evaluated. But I went anyway, slipping away from the station after dark and making my way to the area where Michael had last been seen. The forest was waiting for me. I could feel it the moment I stepped past the tree line, that same watchful hunger I had sensed during the search for Emma. The trees seemed to lean toward me as I walked, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The ground was soft beneath my feet, too soft, as if it might open up at any moment and swallow me whole. I found the stone piles after about an hour of searching. They formed a trail leading north toward the hollows, toward the clearing where I had found Emma's shoes. I followed them with my weapon drawn and my flashlight cutting through the darkness, knowing that I might be walking into a trap, knowing that I might never walk out again. The trail ended at a different clearing this time, smaller than the first, ringed by pines instead of oaks. In the center of the clearing, placed on a flat stone like an altar, was Michael's missing shoe, and standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, was a figure. It was not the thing from the cavern. It was smaller, child-sized, with long dark hair that hung over its face like a curtain. It was wearing a faded blue dress, the same dress I had seen on the porcelain doll in that underground chamber. And it was watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Eyes that held no humanity, no mercy, no recognition of anything that made me who I was. It raised one hand and pointed at me. Then it pointed at the ground. I looked down. At my feet, barely visible beneath the pine needles, was another trapdoor. I should have run. I should have called for backup, reported the location, waited for help that might never come. But I thought about Michael Torres, 8 years old, probably terrified, probably wondering why no one had come to save him. I thought about Emma Hartley and all the others, decades of missing children whose faces smiled out from faded photographs in dusty case files. I opened the trapdoor and went down. The stairs were different this time, narrower and steeper, descending at an angle that made my head spin. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, casting shadows that moved independently of my flashlight. The smell was stronger than before, thick with decay and something else. Something sweet and cloying that coated the back of my throat. I reached the bottom after what felt like forever. The chamber that opened before me was smaller than the cavern I had discovered during the search for Emma, but it was filled with the same terrible offerings. Toys and clothes and photographs, personal items spanning what looked like generations, all arranged in careful patterns around a central depression in the floor. Michael Torres was sitting in that depression, his legs crossed, his hands folded in his lap. He was alive. He was unharmed. He was smiling. "I am so glad you came, Mr. Ranger," he said. "He has been waiting for you." The darkness behind him began to move. I have thought about that moment every day since it happened. I have replayed it in my mind thousands of times, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that could explain what I witnessed. But the memory always ends the same way, with the darkness taking shape, with that terrible figure rising from the shadows, with Michael Torres turning to look at something I could not see and laughing with a joy that no 8-year-old should possess. "He wants you to understand," Michael said. "He wants you to see what we see." The figure moved toward me. Its limbs did not bend the way limbs should bend. Its body did not move the way bodies should move. It flowed like water, like smoke, like nightmares made solid and given form. I raised my weapon. I knew it would not help. I fired anyway. The bullets passed through the thing without effect, disappearing into its substance like stones into black water. It kept coming, that impossible smile widening until it seemed to split its face in half. I could see teeth now, rows of them, stretching back into a throat that pulsed with its own sickly luminescence. And then Michael spoke again, and his voice was not his voice anymore. It was older, deeper, filled with centuries of hunger and patience and rage. "You cannot stop what is coming. You cannot save them. You can only watch and wait and know that one day you will belong to us too." The figure reached for me. Its fingers were cold, so cold they burned, and where they touched my skin, I felt something being pulled out of me, some essential part of myself being drawn toward that gaping mouth. I do not know how I escaped. I have no memory of the stairs, the trapdoor, the forest above. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, and what the doctors called acute psychological trauma. They told me I had been found wandering on a highway 20 miles from Blackwood Ridge, babbling about children in caves and things that lived in the dark. Michael Torres was never found. I resigned from the Ranger Service 2 weeks after I was released from the hospital. I could not go back to those woods. I could not spend another day pretending that everything was normal, that the disappearances were just accidents, that the thing in the cavern was just a figment of my damaged imagination. But I also could not stay silent. I could not let more children vanish into the darkness while the people responsible for protecting them looked the other way. I started talking. To journalists, to researchers, to anyone who would listen. I told them about Emma Hartley and Michael Torres and all the others. I told them about the stone piles and the symbols and the trapdoors that appeared and vanished like wounds in the earth. I told them about the figure in the cavern, the thing that had hunted in Blackwood Ridge for over 100 years, the thing that was still hunting there to this day. Most people thought I was crazy. Some people believed me. A few, a precious few, came forward with stories of their own. Stories about other parks and other forests and other things that should not exist. I learned that Blackwood Ridge was not unique. I learned that there are places all over this country, all over the world, where the boundary between our world and something else is thin, where children disappear and are never found, where searchers see things they cannot explain and are told to keep quiet about. I learned that we are not alone in these woods and that the things we share them with are older and hungrier and more patient than we can possibly imagine. It has been 5 years since I left Blackwood Ridge. I live in a city now, as far from any forest as I can get. I sleep with the lights on. I never go outside after dark. And every October, when the leaves start to turn and the air takes on that heavy, waiting quality, I lock my doors and close my curtains and try not to think about the children who are about to vanish from campgrounds and hiking trails across the country. But I cannot stop thinking about them. I cannot stop seeing their faces, the ones who have already been taken, the ones who will be taken this year and next year and the year after that. I cannot stop wondering what happens to them down there in the darkness, whether they suffer, whether they are aware, whether some part of them is still waiting to be rescued. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the shadows in my apartment seem to stretch a little longer than they should, I hear a voice. It is high and thin and achingly familiar. It sounds like a little girl asking for help. It sounds like a little boy laughing with joy. It sounds like all the children I could not save, calling to me from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "Mr. Ranger," they whisper. "Mr. Ranger, come find us. Mr. Ranger, come play." I never answer. I never will. But I know that one day the voice will stop asking and start demanding. I know that one day I will open my door and find a trail of stone piles leading from my doorstep into the darkness. I know that one day the thing from the cavern will come to collect what it believes it is owed. Until then, I will keep talking. I will keep warning anyone who will listen, and I will keep hoping that somewhere out there, someone is paying attention. Someone is looking for answers. Someone is trying to figure out how to stop what is coming before it is too late. If you are planning to visit Blackwood Ridge or any national forest, please be careful. Stay on the marked trails, keep your children close, and if you ever find a pile of stones arranged with impossible care, or a symbol carved into the bark of an ancient tree, or a pair of small shoes placed neatly at the base of a pine, run. Run and do not look back. Because something is watching, something is waiting, and it is always, always hungry. I need to tell you about what happened after I left the hospital. I need you to understand that the story does not end with my escape from that cavern, that the thing I encountered in Blackwood Ridge did not simply let me go. In the months following my resignation, I tried to rebuild my life. I moved to Portland, found a small apartment in a building with no trees nearby, took a job doing security work at a warehouse that operated only during daylight hours. I thought distance would help. I thought that if I could just put enough miles between myself and that forest, the memories would fade and the nightmares would stop. I was wrong. The dreams started about 3 weeks after I arrived in Portland. They were always the same, at least in the beginning. I would find myself back in the hollows, walking through the endless ranks of ancient pines, following a trail of stone piles that wound deeper and deeper into the darkness. I could never turn back. I could never change direction. I could only walk, step after step, knowing that something was waiting for me at the end of the trail. And at the end, there was always the clearing, the shoes, the trapdoor, the stairs descending into the earth. I would wake up before I reached the bottom, gasping and soaked in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I would lie there in the darkness of my apartment, listening to the sounds of the city, telling myself that it was just a dream, that I was safe, that the thing in the cavern could not reach me here. But then I would notice the dirt on my feet, the pine needles in my hair, the scratches on my arms from branches I did not remember touching. I was sleepwalking. Somehow, in my sleep, I was leaving my apartment and walking for miles without waking. I do not know how far I went on those nights. I do not know what I did or where I ended up. I only know that I would wake in the morning with evidence of journeys I could not recall, and that each time, the dirt on my feet was a little darker, a little more like the soil I remembered from the hollows. I installed locks on my doors, the kind that required a key to open from either side. I bought cameras and motion sensors and alarms that would wake me if I tried to leave. For a while, the precautions seemed to work. I would wake to find the alarms blaring and myself standing at the door, hands pressed against the wood, mouth moving in words I could not hear. But then the precautions started to fail. I would wake up outside the building, standing in the parking lot or the street, my keys nowhere to be found. The cameras would show me opening locks I did not remember unlocking, disabling alarms I did not remember touching, moving through my apartment with the precise mechanical efficiency of someone following instructions from a source I could not identify. And always I would be facing north, toward the mountains, toward the forests, toward Blackwood Ridge. I sought help. I saw doctors and therapists and sleep specialists who hooked me up to machines and watched me through the night. They found nothing wrong with my brain, my body, my neurological function. They suggested medications and relaxation techniques and lifestyle changes that made no difference whatsoever. One doctor, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in unusual sleep disorders, took me aside after my final appointment and said something that chilled me to my core. "I have never seen readings like yours," she told me. "When you sleep, your brain activity shows patterns that we do not have names for. It is like you are communicating with something, receiving signals from a source that our equipment cannot detect. I do not know what is happening to you, but I do not think it is medical." She paused, looked around to make sure no one was listening, and then leaned closer. "I think something is calling you," she said, "and I think it is getting stronger." I stopped seeing doctors after that. What was the point? They could not help me. No one could help me. Whatever connection had been forged in that cavern, whatever claim the thing beneath Blackwood Ridge had made on me, it was not something that could be severed with pills or therapy or positive thinking. I started researching again, this time with a more desperate focus. I read everything I could find about the phenomena I had experienced, about sleepwalking and missing persons and ancient things that lived in forests. I contacted other survivors, people who had encountered similar entities in other parts of the country, and compared notes on symptoms and behaviors. What I learned was terrifying. The thing in Blackwood Ridge was not unique. It was part of something larger, something older, something that had been feeding on humanity since before we had words to describe it. Different cultures had different names for it. Different regions had different manifestations. But the core pattern was always the same. Children disappeared, offerings were left, and those who went looking for answers sometimes came back changed, or did not come back at all. I found accounts of rangers and searchers and parents who had experienced what I experienced, who had descended into darkness and escaped with their lives but not their sanity. Many of them had suffered the same symptoms I was suffering: sleepwalking, dreams, an inexorable pull toward the place where they had first encountered the entity. Most of them eventually gave in. They returned to the forest, walked into the trees, and were never seen again. I swore that would not be my fate. I swore that I would fight, that I would find some way to break the connection, that I would not let the thing beneath Blackwood Ridge claim me the way it had claimed so many others. But the call grew stronger every day. I started hearing it while I was awake, faint at first, like a radio playing in another room, too quiet to make out the words but too persistent to ignore. It was always there, beneath the sounds of traffic and conversation and the normal rhythms of city life. A whisper, a summons, a promise of answers if I would only come and see. I started seeing things too. Glimpses in my peripheral vision, tall, thin shapes standing at the edges of parking lots and peering through windows and watching me from the shadows of buildings. They were never there when I looked directly at them. They were always there when I looked away. And then, about 18 months after my escape from the cavern, I received a package. It arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, a plain cardboard box with no return address and a postmark I could not read. Inside, nestled in a bed of pine needles that still smelled fresh, was a porcelain doll. It was wearing a faded blue dress. I recognized it immediately. It was the same doll I had seen in the chamber beneath Blackwood Ridge, the same doll whose outstretched hand had led me down those terrible stairs. But now it was here, in my apartment, hundreds of miles from the forest where it belonged. There was a note underneath it, written on paper, that crumbled at the edges like dried leaves. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as if the person holding the pen had struggled to control their movements. "We miss you," the note said. "Come home soon." I burned the doll. I burned the note. I burned the box and the pine needles and watched the smoke rise into the gray Portland sky. But even as the flames consumed them, I knew it would not matter. The message had been received. The entity knew where I was. It was only a matter of time. The next few months were the worst of my life. The sleepwalking intensified. The whispers grew louder. The shapes at the edge of my vision became bolder, lingering longer, sometimes turning to face me with expressions I could not quite see but could somehow feel, hungry and patient and certain of eventual triumph. I stopped leaving my apartment during the day. I stopped answering my phone. I stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping properly, stopped doing anything except sitting in my locked room and waiting for the inevitable. And then, on the second anniversary of Emma Hartley's disappearance, I received a phone call. It was from a number I did not recognize, an area code I had never seen before. I almost did not answer. But something made me pick up the phone, some instinct that told me this call was different, that this call might be the thing I had been waiting for without knowing it. The voice on the other end was old and tired and filled with a pain I recognized all too well. "Mr. Cole," it said, "my name is Harold Whitmore. I believe we have something in common." Harold Whitmore had been a ranger at Yellowstone in the 1970s. He had encountered something in the backcountry, something that had taken two of his fellow searchers during a rescue operation gone wrong. He had spent the next 50 years researching the entity, gathering information, building a network of survivors and witnesses and experts, and he had found something, a way to fight back, a way to sever the connection. We talked for 3 hours that first night. He told me things that made everything I had experienced seem like a small piece of a much larger puzzle. He told me about the history of these entities, their origins, their weaknesses, their patterns of behavior. He told me about others who had escaped, who had broken free, who had found ways to live without the constant terror of the call. And he told me about the ritual. I will not describe it here. I cannot. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, too easily misused, too likely to attract the attention of things that are always listening. But I will tell you that it involved returning to Blackwood Ridge. It involved confronting the entity on its own ground. And it involved a sacrifice that still gives me nightmares, even though I know it was necessary. I spent 6 months preparing. Harold guided me through every step, providing materials, teaching techniques, connecting me with others who had attempted similar confrontations in other forests. Not all of them had succeeded. Many of them had died, but enough had survived to give me hope. And in October, exactly 3 years after I first descended into that cavern, I returned to Blackwood Ridge. The forest had not changed. The trails were the same. The trees were the same. The heavy watching presence that I remembered so well was still there, pressing against me from all sides, trying to find a way past my defenses. But I was not the same. I was armored now, protected by knowledge and preparation and the fierce determination of someone who has nothing left to lose. I found the clearing on the second day. The trapdoor was waiting for me, visible this time, as if the entity had decided to stop hiding. I opened it and descended into the darkness without hesitation. The stairs were longer than I remembered. The symbols on the walls were brighter, more aggressive, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to react to my presence. The smell of decay was overwhelming, thick enough to taste, and beneath it was that same sweet, cloying undercurrent that I had never been able to identify. The chamber at the bottom was different too. Larger, fuller. The offerings had multiplied in the years since my first visit, spreading across the floor in drifts of toys and clothes and personal items that represented more victims than I could count. And in the center of it all, standing in that impossible shaft of light, was the entity. It was waiting for me. It had always been waiting for me. I began the ritual. I will not describe what happened next. The memory is too fractured, too painful, too wrapped up in sensations and images that do not translate into words. I will only say that it worked. The ritual worked. The connection that had bound me to that place, that had called to me across hundreds of miles and years of desperate resistance, was severed. But it cost me. When I emerged from the cavern, the sun was rising over Blackwood Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful after the darkness I had just escaped. I was bleeding from wounds I did not remember receiving. I was missing 2 fingers from my left hand. I could not remember my own name for almost an hour. But I was free. The whispers stopped. The sleepwalking stopped. The shapes at the edge of my vision disappeared and never came back. For the first time in 3 years, I could sleep through the night without dreaming of stone piles and trapdoors and children who smiled in the darkness. I went home. I rebuilt my life. I found work that I could do without being reminded of what I had experienced. I even managed to form relationships, to make friends, to do the normal human things that I had thought were lost to me forever. But I never forgot, and I never stopped watching. Because here is the thing about entities like the one beneath Blackwood Ridge. Severing the connection does not destroy them. It does not weaken them. It does not stop them from hunting, from feeding, from taking more children to add to their terrible collections. All it does is set you free, and freedom comes with a burden of its own. I kept in touch with Harold Whitmore until his death 2 years ago. I maintained the network he had built, adding new survivors, gathering new information, preparing new seekers for the confrontations they would face. I became part of something larger than myself, a loose community of people who have seen the darkness and survived to tell about it. And now I am telling you. Not because I want sympathy, not because I want validation, not because I expect you to believe every word of this account. I am telling you because something is changing. The entities are becoming more active, the disappearances are increasing. The boundaries between our world and theirs are thinning in ways that we do not fully understand. In the past 5 years, over 200 children have vanished from national parks and forests across the United States. The official explanations range from drowning to animal attacks to simple getting lost. But I know better. I know that many of those children were taken by something that our explanations cannot account for, something that our authorities refuse to acknowledge, something that is growing stronger with every victim it claims. We are running out of time. I do not know what is coming. I do not know why the entities are becoming more aggressive or what it means for the future of our species. But I know that we cannot keep ignoring the evidence. We cannot keep dismissing the survivors. We cannot keep pretending that the things we have seen are just hallucinations or hoaxes or the products of traumatized minds. Something is out there. Something is hunting. And unless we find a way to stop it, unless we find the courage to face the darkness and fight back, it will never stop taking. I think about Emma Hartley sometimes. I think about her pink sneakers with the cartoon rabbits on the sides. I think about her smile, the way it looked when I saw her standing in that shaft of impossible light. And I wonder what became of her. Is she still down there, suspended in some timeless darkness, waiting for someone to find her? Or has she become something else entirely, transformed by years of exposure to the entity's influence into a thing that no longer remembers what it was to be human? I do not know. I will probably never know. But I hope, with whatever part of me still believes in hope, that she found peace. I hope that whatever happens to the children who are taken, it is not endless suffering. I hope that somewhere, somehow, there is mercy even in the darkness. Because if there is not, then all of this has been for nothing. All of the fighting and the surviving and the telling has been nothing more than a futile gesture against an enemy that cannot be defeated, cannot be stopped, cannot be anything but endured until it decides to end us. And I am not ready to believe that. Not yet, not ever, if I can help it. So I keep telling the story. I keep warning the hikers and the campers and the parents who are planning their next family trip to one of our beautiful national forests. I keep hoping that one day someone with more resources and more power than I have will take the threat seriously and do something about it. Until then, all I can do is watch. All I can do is wait. All I can do is remember the faces of the children I could not save and pray that someday, somehow, their story will have an ending. Be careful out there. The woods are full of wonders, but they are also full of things that wonder back. And some of them are hungry. I have one more thing to tell you. Something I have never shared with anyone, not even Harold Whitmore, not even the other survivors in our network. On the night I completed the ritual, in those final moments before I lost consciousness and woke up on the forest floor with the sunrise painting the sky, I saw something. The entity was there, towering above me in all its terrible glory, its limbs bent at impossible angles, its face split by that endless, hungry smile. But it was not alone. Behind it, stretching back into the darkness as far as I could see, were others. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. A vast army of impossible shapes, each one different, each one wrong, each one radiating the same ancient hunger that I had felt from the thing beneath Blackwood Ridge. And they were all looking at me. Not with anger, not with malice, with something worse, curiosity. One of them stepped forward, a shape that was taller and darker than the rest, a shape that seemed to consume the light around it rather than reflect it. It leaned down toward me, and for one terrible moment I could see its face. It was human, or it had been once, a long time ago. But now it was stretched and twisted and changed into something that no longer fit any definition of humanity I understood. Its eyes were pits of absolute darkness. Its mouth was a wound that leaked shadows. And when it spoke, its voice was the sound of children crying in the night. "You are different," it said. "You are strong. You might survive what is coming." It reached out one long finger and touched my forehead. The pain was indescribable, a burning cold that seemed to freeze my blood and boil my brain simultaneously. But through the pain, I saw something. I saw a vision of the future, a forest that covered the entire world, dark and ancient and filled with things that moved through the shadows. I saw cities in ruins, their towers draped in vines, their streets silent except for the rustling of creatures I could not name. I saw the sky blocked by a canopy so thick that sunlight became a distant memory. And I saw people, survivors like me, huddled in the last patches of light, fighting a war they could not win against an enemy they could not understand. The vision faded. The entity withdrew its finger, and as I collapsed to the ground, as the darkness finally claimed me, I heard it speak one final time. "We have been patient," it said. "We have been waiting. But the time of waiting is almost over. The time of the forest is almost here." I woke up in the clearing with the sun rising and my fingers missing and my mind shattered into 1,000 pieces that took years to put back together. But I never forgot that vision. I never forgot what the entity showed me, and I never stopped wondering when it would come true. I watch the news now with different eyes. I see the reports of climate change and deforestation and the shrinking of wild places, and I wonder if any of it matters. I wonder if the forests need our help at all, or if they have simply been biding their time, waiting for the moment when they would be ready to take back what was always theirs. I do not know the answer. I am not sure I want to know. But I will keep fighting. I will keep telling the story. I will keep hoping that somewhere out there, someone is listening. Because if the vision I saw in that cavern was true, then we do not have much time left. And when the time of the forest finally arrives, I want to be ready. I want us all to be ready. So please, if you take nothing else from this account, take this. Be careful in the woods. Watch your children. Trust your instincts when they tell you that something is wrong. And if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a clearing in the deep forest, staring at a trail of stone piles that leads into the darkness, do not follow it. Turn around. Walk away. Run if you have to. Because something is waiting at the end of that trail. Something that has been waiting for a very long time. And it knows your name. It knows all of our names. And one day, maybe one day soon, it is going to call us home. This is Marcus Cole, former ranger at Blackwood Ridge National Forest, signing off. May you never see what I have seen. May you never hear what I have heard. May you never know the sound of children calling from the darkness. But if you do, remember this story. Remember that you are not alone. Remember that others have faced the darkness and survived. And remember that sometimes surviving is enough. The forest is patient. The forest is old. The forest remembers everything. But so do we. So do we. Stay safe out there. And whatever you do, whatever happens, whatever you see or hear or feel, do not go looking for the children in the woods, because they are not children anymore, and they are waiting for you. I'm a forest ranger at Mount Hood. I think something's wrong here. My old truck's engine sputtered and coughed as I pushed it up the winding mountain road, the smell of burning fuel mixing with the cold pine air that seeped through the cracked window seal. The gas gauge had been hovering just above empty for the last 15 miles, and I was starting to wonder if I would make it to the ranger station before the ancient Ford finally gave up the ghost. It was October, and the aspens had turned to gold against the dark green of the Douglas firs, but I could not appreciate the beauty. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the forest seemed to press in on either side of the road, in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the mountain. My name is Daniel Marsh, and I have been a forest ranger at Mount Hood National Forest for 11 years. In that time, I have seen things that would make most people lock their doors and never set foot in the wilderness again. I am writing this now because I need someone to know what is happening out here. I need someone to understand why I cannot sleep anymore. Why I flinch at every sound in the night, and why I have started keeping a loaded rifle by my bed even though regulations strictly forbid it. The truck finally crested the last hill and I saw the ranger station ahead. a squat wooden building that had been standing since the 1930s. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which meant Frank Holbrook was already there. Frank had been working Mount Hood since before I was born, a grizzled veteran who knew every trail and every hollow and every dark place where the trees grew so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. He was the one who had first told me about the disappearances, about the cases that did not fit any pattern, about the things that happened in these woods that never made it into any official report. I pulled into the gravel lot and killed the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. The forest around the station was utterly still, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering in the branches, just the faint creak of cooling metal from the truck's engine and the distant whisper of wind through the trees. I grabbed my pack and headed inside. Frank was sitting at the old wooden desk, a cup of coffee steaming beside him and a stack of papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when I came in, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. Not the cautious wariness that every experienced ranger develops after years in the backcountry, but genuine bone-deep terror. He told me to close the door and sit down. He told me that we had a problem. 3 hikers had gone missing in the past 2 weeks. The first was a young woman named Rebecca Chen, 24 years old, an experienced backpacker who had been doing a solo trip along the Timberline Trail. She had checked in at the Cloud Cap Inn on October 3rd and was supposed to reach the Ramona Falls trailhead by October 5th. She never arrived. Search and rescue teams had been combing the area for 10 days and had found nothing. Not her pack, not her tent, not a single piece of gear. She had simply vanished. The second disappearance happened on October 8th. A married couple from Seattle, James and Patricia Morrison, both in their 50s, experienced hikers who had been coming to Mount Hood every autumn for 20 years. They had set out from the Top Spur trailhead for a day hike to McNeil Point. When they did not return to their car by nightfall, a search was initiated. The only thing the searchers found was Patricia's hiking pole, lying in the middle of the trail about 3 miles from the trailhead. It was standing upright, driven into the dirt as if it had been planted there deliberately. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks leading off the trail, no indication of what had happened to them. The third disappearance was the one that had shaken Frank the most. It was a ranger, a young guy named Tyler Brooks, 28 years old, who had only been working Mount Hood for 2 years. Tyler had gone out on October 12th to check on some reports of illegal camping in the Lost Lake area. He had radioed in at 2:15 in the afternoon to say he was heading off trail to investigate some unusual tracks he had found. That was the last anyone heard from him. His truck was still parked at the Lost Lake trailhead. His radio was found the next day, sitting on a fallen log about half a mile into the forest. It was still turned on, the battery almost dead, as if Tyler had set it down and simply walked away. I asked Frank what he thought was happening. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers in front of him. Then he looked up at me and said something that made my blood run cold. He said that it was starting again. He said that the last time this many people disappeared this quickly was in 1987, when 6 hikers vanished over the course of a single month. The official explanation was that an unusually early winter storm had caught them unprepared, but Frank had been there. He had been part of the search teams, and he knew that the weather had nothing to do with it. Frank told me about the patterns he had noticed over the decades. The disappearances always happened in clusters, usually in autumn, when the days grew short and the fog rolled in thick and heavy from the coast. They always happened in certain areas, places deep in the backcountry where the old-growth forest had never been logged, where the trees were so ancient that their roots had been drinking from the mountain springs since before the first humans ever set foot in this land. And they always happened to people who went off the trail, who pushed into places where they were not supposed to go, who got too close to something that did not want to be found. I asked him what that something was. Frank shook his head. He said he did not know, not really, but he told me about the stories. The native tribes who had lived in this region for thousands of years, the Multnomah and the Clackamas and the Wasco, they all had legends about something that dwelt in the high places of the mountain. They called it by different names, but all the stories agreed on certain details. It was old, older than the mountain itself. It did not like to be seen. It could make itself sound like anything it wanted, a bird, a stream, a human voice calling for help. And it was always hungry. I am not a superstitious man. I believe in science and evidence and rational explanation. But I also knew Frank, and I knew that he was not the kind of person who believed in fairy tales. If he was scared, then there was something to be scared of. I asked him what we should do. He said that we needed to find out what happened to Tyler. Tyler was one of us, and we did not abandon our own. But we needed to be careful. We needed to stay on the trails, stay together, and get out before dark. Under no circumstances were we to follow any sounds into the forest, no matter how much they sounded like someone in distress. He looked me in the eye when he said that, and I understood that he was not just giving me advice. He was giving me a warning. We set out the next morning, just after dawn. The fog was thick enough to cut with a knife, rolling through the trees in gray waves that reduced visibility to maybe 30 feet. Frank led the way, moving with a slow, deliberate caution that I had never seen from him before. He kept stopping to listen, his head tilted to one side, his eyes scanning the forest around us. I found myself doing the same, my ears straining for any sound that did not belong. But there was nothing, just the drip of moisture from the branches and the muffled crunch of our boots on the trail. We reached the Lost Lake trailhead around 9 in the morning. Tyler's truck was still there, covered in a thin layer of frost. I checked the doors and found them unlocked. His keys were still in the ignition. His wallet was in the center console, along with his phone, which was dead. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. It looked like he had simply parked his truck, got out, and walked into the woods. We followed the trail toward the spot where Tyler's radio had been found. The fog seemed to grow thicker as we moved deeper into the forest, and the trees grew taller and older, their massive trunks draped in curtains of pale green moss. I had been in this part of the forest before, many times, but it felt different now. Alien, hostile, as if the trees themselves were aware of our presence and did not welcome it. We found the fallen log where Tyler's radio had been recovered. Frank stopped there, examining the ground around the log with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I asked him what he was looking for. He said, tracks. Tyler's tracks had led from the trail to this log, but they had not led away. The searchers had assumed that he had doubled back on his own trail, but Frank was not so sure. He pointed to a spot on the far side of the log, where the moss had been disturbed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but once he pointed it out, I could see it clearly. Something had moved through here, something heavy enough to crush the moss, but careful enough not to leave any other sign of its passage. And it had been heading deeper into the forest, away from the trail, into an area that was not on any map. I asked Frank if we should follow. He looked at me for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he shook his head. He said that we should mark the location and come back with more people, better equipment, maybe some dogs. He said that we should not go any further into the forest today. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that the search teams had already been through this area. They had dogs. They had equipment. They had found nothing. Whatever had taken Tyler, it had not left a trail that any dog could follow. We turned back toward the trailhead. The fog had grown even thicker while we were examining the log, and I could barely see Frank's back just 10 feet ahead of me. I kept my eyes on him, focusing on the dark shape of his jacket, trying not to think about what might be moving through the trees on either side of us. We had been walking for maybe 5 minutes when I heard it. My name, spoken in a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Daniel. I stopped dead, my heart slamming against my ribs. Frank must have heard it too, because he stopped as well, turning to look at me with wide eyes. I asked him if he had said something. He shook his head. The forest was silent around us, that terrible, heavy silence that I had come to associate with something deeply wrong. And then, from somewhere off to our left, I heard the crying. It was the same sound I had heard on my first encounter, that high, keening wail like a child sobbing in the darkness. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go toward it, to help whoever was making that terrible sound. But Frank grabbed my arm and held me back. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to bruise. He did not say anything. He did not have to. The look on his face said it all. We ran. I am not ashamed to admit it. We ran back down that trail like our lives depended on it, which I suspect they did. The crying followed us, sometimes seeming to come from just behind us, sometimes from far ahead, sometimes from all directions at once, and underneath the crying, I could hear something else. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to shake the ground with each impact. But when I looked back, there was nothing there, just the fog and the trees and the endless, oppressive silence. We made it back to the trailhead just as the fog began to lift. By the time we reached our trucks, the sun was breaking through the clouds and the forest looked almost normal again. Almost. Frank leaned against the hood of his truck, breathing hard, his face pale and slick with sweat. I asked him what the hell had just happened. He did not answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said that it knew we were looking for Tyler. He said that it did not want us to find him. I went home that night, but I did not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice whispering my name. I heard the crying. I felt the presence of something vast and ancient and hungry pressing against the walls of my house, testing for weakness. My wife Sarah asked me what was wrong. I told her I was just tired, just stressed from work. She did not believe me. I could see it in her eyes, but she did not push. She never pushed. That was one of the things I loved about her, and one of the things that made me feel most guilty for not telling her the truth. The disappearances continued. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more people vanished. A father and son from California who were camping near Trillium Lake, a solo photographer who had been taking pictures of the autumn foliage along the Mirror Lake Trail, and another ranger, a woman named Carmen Vasquez who had been my friend for 6 years. Carmen went out to check on a report of a downed tree blocking the Burnt Lake Trail. She radioed in at 11:30 in the morning to say she was on her way back. She never arrived. The official story was that an early winter storm had caught people off guard, that the conditions were unusually dangerous, that this was a tragic but ultimately explainable series of accidents. But those of us who worked the mountain knew better. We had seen the weather reports. We had been on those trails. There was no storm, no unusual conditions, nothing that could explain why 6 people had vanished without a trace in less than a month. Something was taking them. Something that moved through the forest like a ghost, leaving no tracks and no evidence. Something that could make itself sound like anything it wanted. Frank called a meeting of all the rangers still willing to work the mountain. There were not many of us left. Several had quit outright, citing family emergencies or health problems or simply refusing to come back. The ones who remained gathered in the ranger station on a cold November evening, the fire crackling in the wood stove and the wind howling outside. Frank stood at the front of the room, his face grave. He told us that he had been doing some research. He had been digging through old records, archives that went back to the earliest days of the Forest Service, and he had found something disturbing. The disappearances were not new. They had been happening for as long as there had been records to keep. The first documented case was in 1896, when a surveying team of 3 men vanished while mapping the western slopes of the mountain. Their camp was found intact, their supplies untouched, their horses still tethered to the trees. There was no sign of violence, no indication of what had happened. They simply ceased to exist. Over the following decades, there had been dozens more cases: loggers, hunters, hikers, climbers, even a group of soldiers who had been training in the area during World War II. The patterns were always the same. People went into certain areas of the forest and did not come out. Their gear was sometimes found, their vehicles sometimes recovered, but their bodies were never seen again. Frank pulled out a map and spread it on the table. It was a topographical map of Mount Hood National Forest, but someone had marked it up with red ink. Dozens of red dots scattered across the wilderness, concentrated in certain areas and sparse in others. Each dot represented a disappearance, and when you looked at them all together, a pattern emerged. The dots formed a rough circle around a particular region of the forest, an area about 5 miles in diameter that was centered on a place called Pinnacle Ridge. I had heard of Pinnacle Ridge. Everyone who worked the mountain had. It was a remote, rugged area of old-growth forest and basalt cliffs, accessible only by a single unmaintained trail that was not even on the official maps. Rangers avoided it. Hikers were warned away from it, and according to Frank's map, it was the source of everything. I asked Frank what he thought was at Pinnacle Ridge. He shook his head. He said he did not know. He said that in 40 years of working this mountain, he had never gone there. No one had, at least no one who came back. The native legend spoke of a dwelling place, a lair where the thing that haunted these woods retreated when it was not hunting. But the legends also said that anyone who found that place would never leave it. Frank looked at each of us in turn, his eyes hard and steady. He said that he was not asking anyone to go there. He said that we should close the forest, evacuate the remaining visitors, and wait for whatever was happening to stop. It had stopped before, he said. The clusters of disappearances always ended eventually. We just had to ride it out. I wanted to agree with him. I wanted to believe that we could just close our eyes and wait for the nightmare to pass. But I kept thinking about Carmen, about Tyler, about Rebecca Chen and James and Patricia Morrison, and all the others whose names I did not know. They had families. They had people who loved them, people who were waiting for them to come home. How could I just sit back and do nothing while something hunted them like animals in the forest I was sworn to protect? I told Frank that I was going to Pinnacle Ridge. I told him that I had to know what was out there, that I could not live with myself if I did not at least try. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been respect, or might have been pity. He said that if I was determined to go, I would not go alone. He said that he would come with me. And then, one by one, the other rangers in the room stood up and said the same. There were 5 of us in total. 5 people willing to walk into the heart of whatever nightmare had claimed so many lives. Looking back, I realize how foolish we were, how arrogant. We thought that numbers and preparation and determination would be enough to protect us from something that had been hunting these woods since before our grandparents were born. We were wrong. We set out at first light on November 15th. The weather was clear and cold, the sky a pale blue that seemed to stretch forever above the snow-capped peak of Mount Hood. We carried enough supplies for 3 days, along with radios, GPS units, satellite phones, and every piece of emergency equipment we could fit in our packs. Frank led the way, following a faint trail that wound through the old-growth forest toward Pinnacle Ridge. The trees here were massive, ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars that towered 200 feet or more above our heads. Their branches were draped with pale green lichen that hung down like curtains, filtering the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns and moss, and the air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was beautiful in a primordial sort of way, but it was also deeply unsettling. There was no sound except our own breathing and the crunch of our boots on the trail. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling the branches, just silence, heavy and absolute, pressing down on us like a physical weight. We made good progress through the morning, covering maybe 6 miles by noon. The trail grew fainter as we went, barely more than a deer path winding through the undergrowth. Frank stopped frequently to check his compass and GPS, making sure we were still heading in the right direction. The others followed in single file, each of us keeping the person ahead in sight at all times. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. We all knew what we were walking into, even if we did not want to admit it. The first sign that something was wrong came around 2 in the afternoon. We had stopped for a break in a small clearing, eating energy bars and checking our equipment. I was looking at the map on my GPS when I noticed something strange. According to the device, we had only traveled about 4 miles from the trailhead, but according to my watch, we had been walking for nearly 6 hours. That did not make sense. We had been moving at a steady pace, covering at least a mile per hour, even through the rough terrain. We should have been much farther than 4 miles. I showed the GPS to Frank. He looked at it, then looked at his own device. His showed the same thing. 4 miles from the start. He checked his compass. The needle was spinning slowly, unable to find north. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw real fear in his eyes. We pressed on. What else could we do? We had come too far to turn back, and besides, I had the growing suspicion that the forest would not let us turn back even if we wanted to. The trail had completely disappeared by this point, swallowed up by the undergrowth. We were navigating by dead reckoning now, trying to keep the mountain peak at our backs and the setting sun on our right. But the trees were so thick that we could barely see the sky, and the sun seemed to move in strange ways, jumping from one position to another when we were not looking directly at it. By late afternoon, we had entered a part of the forest that I had never seen before. The trees here were different, older somehow, their bark black and rough and covered in strange patterns that almost looked like writing. The moss on the ground was darker too, more gray than green, and it squished unpleasantly under our boots like something rotting. The air had grown colder, and there was a smell on the wind that I could not identify. Something between copper and decay, like old blood and wet leaves. I called a halt. We needed to make camp before dark. Whatever was out here, I did not want to face it at night. We found a relatively clear spot between 2 massive fallen trees and set up our tents. Frank built a fire while the rest of us gathered wood and checked the perimeter. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the trees, and the temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath fogging in front of my face, and my fingers were numb despite my gloves. We ate a quick dinner of freeze-dried meals and huddled around the fire, speaking in low voices about nothing in particular. No one wanted to acknowledge the fear that we all felt. No one wanted to be the first to admit that this had been a mistake. The night came on fast and heavy, the darkness pressing in around our little circle of firelight like a living thing. I took the first watch, sitting with my back against one of the fallen trees and my rifle across my knees. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the blackness. Beyond its light, there was nothing. Just darkness so complete that it seemed to have texture, to have weight. I strained my eyes and ears, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that we were not alone. For the first hour, there was nothing. Just the fire and the darkness and the steady breathing of my companions in their tents. Then I heard the crying. It came from somewhere out in the forest, that same high keening wail that I had heard twice before. It started soft, almost inaudible, like a child sobbing far in the distance, but it grew louder as the minutes passed, closer, until it seemed to be coming from just beyond the firelight. I gripped my rifle and called out, demanding to know who was there. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman, watching me from the darkness. I woke Frank. He came out of his tent with his rifle already in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkness. I told him what I had heard. He nodded, his face grim. He told me to wake the others. We were not sleeping anymore tonight. We gathered around the fire, 5 people with 5 rifles, watching the darkness and waiting for something to happen. The fire burned lower as the hours passed, the flames dying down to embers and then building back up as we added more wood. The cold grew more intense, a bone-deep chill that our fire could not seem to touch, and the presence in the darkness remained, patient and watchful. Just before dawn, it showed itself. I do not know how to describe what I saw. The human mind is not equipped to process certain things, and I think this was one of them. What I remember is this. The darkness between 2 trees seemed to thicken, to coalesce, to take on a form that was almost but not quite human. It was tall, impossibly tall, towering over the ancient cedars like they were saplings. Its body was made of shadow and fog, shifting and rippling like smoke in a wind that I could not feel. And where its face should have been, there was just a pale oval of light, featureless and cold, like a moon that had fallen from the sky and lodged itself in the body of a nightmare. It did not attack. It did not speak. It simply stood there, watching us, for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then it turned, slowly, deliberately, and melted back into the forest. The darkness released it, swallowed it up, and it was gone. But in the moment before it vanished, it looked directly at me. I felt its attention like a physical force, a pressure behind my eyes and in my chest, and I knew with absolute certainty that it had marked me, that whatever happened next, I would not escape. None of us spoke about what we had seen. We broke camp as soon as there was enough light to see, packing our gear with shaking hands and setting out toward Pinnacle Ridge. There was no discussion of turning back. We all knew, somehow, that turning back was no longer an option. The thing in the forest had seen us. It would not let us leave. The only way out was forward, through whatever hell awaited us at the heart of its domain. The forest changed as we went deeper. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so dense that almost no light filtered through. The air grew thicker, heavier, filled with that same smell of copper and decay. The ground beneath our feet became soft and spongy, like walking on the surface of something alive. And the silence grew more intense, more oppressive, until it felt like a physical presence pressing down on us from all sides. We found the first body around mid-morning. It was lying in a small depression between the roots of an enormous cedar, curled up on its side like someone sleeping. I recognized the jacket immediately. It was Tyler. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and reached down to turn him over. His face was intact, his eyes closed, his expression peaceful. There was no sign of injury, no mark of violence. He looked like he had simply laid down and gone to sleep, but his skin was cold and gray, and when I checked for a pulse, there was nothing. He had been dead for days. We found the others not far away. Rebecca Chen, still wearing her backpack. James and Patricia Morrison, lying side by side with their hands almost touching. Carmen Vasquez, my friend, who had smiled at me just 2 weeks ago and told me to be careful out there. They were all arranged the same way, curled up on their sides, peaceful, unmarked. They looked like they had come here willingly, laid down in the soft moss, and let themselves die. And maybe they had. Maybe whatever had called to them from the forest had promised them peace, promised them rest, promised them an end to fear. Maybe they had believed it. I wanted to bury them. I wanted to at least give them that much dignity. But Frank said there was no time. He said that we needed to find the source, find whatever was doing this, and stop it if we could. The bodies would still be here when we were done. If we were done. If any of us survived. We pressed on. The forest grew darker and stranger with every step. The trees were twisted now, their trunks bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching toward the ground instead of the sky. The moss on the ground had turned black, and it seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic movement that might have been breathing. The air was so thick with that copper smell that I could taste it on my tongue, and there was a sound beneath the silence now, a deep vibration that I felt more than heard, like the heartbeat of something impossibly vast. We reached Pinnacle Ridge just after noon, or what we assumed was noon. The darkness was so complete by this point that we had lost all sense of time. Our flashlights cut pale beams through the gloom, illuminating twisted trees and black moss and things that moved just at the edge of vision. The ridge itself was a wall of basalt, rising sheer and dark from the forest floor. At its base there was an opening, not a cave exactly, more like a wound, a place where the rock had split open and the darkness had come flooding out. Frank stopped at the edge of the opening. He turned to look at us, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen before. Resolution. Acceptance. He said that he was going in. He said that someone had to, and he was the oldest, the one with the least to lose. I tried to argue, tried to tell him that we should stick together, but he shook his head. He said that if he did not come out in an hour, we should leave. We should run as fast as we could and never look back. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, and it swallowed him whole. We waited. The darkness pressed in around us, and the deep vibration grew stronger, and things moved in the shadows at the edge of our lights. We waited for an hour, then 2, then 3. Frank did not come back. The others started talking about leaving, about following his last instructions and getting out while we still could. But I could not move. I kept staring at that wound in the rock, that doorway into nothing, and I knew that I could not leave without knowing what was inside. I told the others to go. I told them I would catch up. Then I walked into the darkness after Frank. I do not know how to describe what I found inside. The human mind is not equipped to process certain things, and this is one of them. What I remember is darkness so complete that my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by it, the beam extending maybe 3 feet before disappearing entirely. I remember walls that were not stone, but something else. Something that yielded slightly under my touch like flesh. I remember sounds that might have been voices, whispering in languages that predated human speech. And I remember a presence, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent, watching me with something that was not curiosity and was not hunger, but was worse than both. I found Frank at the heart of it. He was standing in a cavern, if you could call it that, at the center of a circle of pale light that had no visible source. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing. His mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. He looked like a man in a trance, or a man in prayer, or a man who had finally understood something that had broken his mind entirely. I called his name. I grabbed his shoulder. I shook him as hard as I could. But he did not respond. He was gone. Lost to whatever he had found in this place. I do not know how long I stood there with him. Time did not exist in that cavern, but eventually I became aware of something else, a change in the darkness, a shift in the presence that surrounded me, and then I heard it, a voice. Not the whisper that had followed me through the forest, something else, something that spoke directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. It said that it was old. It said that it had been here since before the mountain rose from the sea, since before the first tree took root in the volcanic soil. It said that it was not evil, not in any way that humans could understand. It was simply hungry. It had been sleeping for a long time, and it was waking up now, and it needed to feed. The people who had disappeared, they had not suffered. They had simply been consumed, their essence absorbed into something larger and older than they could comprehend. It was not cruel. It was natural. It was inevitable. I asked it why it was telling me this, why it did not simply take me like it had taken the others. The voice was silent for a moment. Then it said that I was different. I had come looking for it, had pushed through the fear and the warnings and the terrible certainty of death to find the truth. It found that interesting. It found that worthy of a reward. It offered me a choice. I could stay here, in the darkness, and become part of it forever. Or I could leave, go back to my life, and carry the knowledge of what I had seen into the world outside. But if I chose to leave, I would never be free of it. It would always be with me, watching from the shadows, whispering in the night. I would live the rest of my life knowing that something vast and hungry was waiting for me, and that one day, when it was ready, it would call me back. I chose to leave. I do not remember walking out of that cavern. I do not remember the journey back through the twisted forest. The next thing I recall clearly is standing at the edge of a logging road, my clothes torn, and my body covered in scratches and bruises that I did not remember receiving. It was morning. The sun was shining. Birds were singing in the trees, and I was alone. Frank never came out. Neither did the other rangers who had entered the forest with me. I was the only one who made it back. The official story is that we got lost in an early winter storm, that the others died of exposure, that I was found wandering in shock after days without food or water. There was no investigation. There were no questions. The Forest Service closed the backcountry for the rest of the season, and by spring, everyone seemed to have forgotten that anything had happened at all. But I remember. I remember every detail, every whisper, every moment of that nightmare, and I know that it is not over. The presence is still with me, just like it promised. I hear its voice in the silence of my house at night. I see its shadow at the corner of my vision when I am alone. It is patient. It is waiting. And one day I know it will call me back to Pinnacle Ridge, back to that wound in the rock, back to the darkness that has no end. I am writing this now as a warning. If you ever find yourself at Mount Hood National Forest, stay on the trails, stay with your group. And if you hear something in the woods, a voice calling your name, a child crying in the darkness, do not follow it. Do not go looking for the truth. Some truths are not meant to be found. Some hungers are not meant to be satisfied. And some places in this world are not for us, have never been for us, and will remain long after we are gone. I have been a forest ranger at Mount Hood National Forest for 11 years. In 3 weeks, I am turning in my resignation. I am taking my wife and my daughters, and I am moving as far from these mountains as I can get. I do not know if it will help. I do not know if distance means anything to something that old, that powerful, that patient. But I have to try. I have to believe that there is some escape, some way out, some hope of living a normal life again. Because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is spending the rest of my days waiting for the darkness to come for me, knowing that when it does, there will be no running, no hiding, no escape. Only the long walk into the forest, toward the place where the trees grow twisted and the moss turns black. Only the descent into the wound in the rock, the doorway into nothing. Only the voice, whispering in my mind, welcoming me home. If you never hear from me again, you will know what happened. You will know that it finally called me back, that I finally answered, that I am with the others now in that place beyond the darkness. And if you are smart, if you have any sense at all, you will take this warning and you will stay away from Mount Hood forever. But I know you will not. Humans never do. We are curious creatures, always pushing into places we do not belong, always seeking truths that were never meant for us. That is what it is counting on. That is why it has survived so long, fed so well, grown so strong. It knows that we cannot help ourselves. It knows that there will always be another hiker, another camper, another ranger like me who cannot leave well enough alone. The forest is waiting. The darkness is patient. And somewhere in the heart of Mount Hood National Forest, in a place called Pinnacle Ridge, something very old and very hungry is beginning to stir. I hear it sometimes, even now. In the wind outside my window, in the silence between heartbeats, in the dreams that wake me screaming in the middle of the night. It says my name. It says that it misses me. It says that it will see me soon. And I am afraid. I am more afraid than I have ever been in my life, because I know that it is not lying. I know that one day, despite everything I have done, despite how far I have run, I will find myself back on that mountain, walking into that forest, answering that call. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some darkness, once it has touched you, never really lets go. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am a former forest ranger at Mount Hood National Forest. And if you are reading this, I beg you, do not go looking for me. Do not go looking for the truth. Do not go into those woods, because whatever took me, whatever is waiting in that darkness, it is still hungry, and it is always watching.